Everyone in the tribe had to choose a weapon once they came of age. Some chose long swords, while others picked battle axes. But he chose a shield, because he knew a shield was actually the strongest weapon in this world. After all, this was the world of a brutally difficult game he'd spent 9 years playing. Its name was Dungeon and Stone. In this unforgiving game, death erased all of a character's data and forced the player to start over from scratch. After 9 years of barely eating or sleeping, he'd finally fought his way to the end. At last, he arrived at the final boss's room. Then, a message suddenly appeared on the screen. You may never be able to return. Do you still wish to enter? He had no idea that pressing confirm would shatter his peaceful life forever. After clicking confirm, he started thinking about how to defeat the final boss. But then, 3 more windows suddenly popped up on the screen. Before he could react, a blinding white light burst out of the monitor. His entire body suddenly felt like it was being burned alive. A second later, the light dragged him straight into the screen. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself facing a scene beyond anything he could have imagined. There were no electric lights. The entire area was illuminated by burning torches. He was also surrounded by hulking, muscular barbarians. At the center of the crowd, a tribal chief was roaring at the top of his lungs. He looked down at his strange new body and realized he'd become a muscular barbarian too. It seemed they were in the middle of some kind of ceremony. Whenever a name was called, that person stepped forward to choose a weapon. As the young barbarians took turns choosing, the scene began to feel disturbingly familiar. The words Raftonia's blessing confirmed it. This was the world of Dungeon and Stone. Somehow, he'd been transported into the game as a barbarian. Just then, a voice beside him caught his attention. Another barbarian was trembling as he muttered, "Isn't this Dungeon and Stone? Why am I here?" Seeing the man shake in terror, he realized he wasn't the only one who'd been pulled into the game. This man was clearly another player like him. But then, a thunderous voice made his entire body freeze. Who just spoke? The tribal chief suddenly appeared before them and glared down at him. Was it you? No. He immediately turned his gaze toward the red-haired barbarian beside him. The chief followed his eyes and glared at the redhead. Then it was you. The red-haired barbarian looked completely confused. Me? What did I do? Before he could finish, the chief swung his axe and beheaded him on the spot. As he watched the severed head roll aside, his mind went blank and terror surged through him. But he knew that if the chief noticed his fear, he would be next. So he forced himself to stay calm and met the chief's gaze without flinching. The chief then roared. Orim, son of Kadua, was possessed by an evil spirit. Young warriors forget every word that evil spirit just spoke. Only then did everything click. People like him and the dead man were considered evil spirits in this world. If their true identities were exposed, they'd be killed instantly. He had to finish the coming-of-age ceremony without being discovered. But there was one fatal problem. He had no idea what his name was, and no character window had appeared since he'd arrived. As the chief called names one by one, he noticed that each person waited roughly 2 seconds before stepping forward. His chances were slim, but this was the only plan he had. Then the chief shouted, Bjorn, son of Yandel. Under his breath, he counted. 1 second, 2 seconds. 2 seconds passed, but no one moved. So he immediately stepped forward. Bjorn. That had to be his name. He walked up to the chief, and the two stared at each other. Then the chief burst out laughing. Choose the weapon you want. At those words, the crushing weight on his chest finally lifted. Next came his second crucial decision. Barbarians had no natural talent for magic, but their physical abilities were exceptional. Back when he played the game, he'd tried building barbarians as melee damage dealers. But every battle became a life-or-death gamble. The build was incredibly unstable, and the character always ended up becoming a berserker. Then, one day, he discovered another piece of equipment that perfectly suited barbarians. A shield. Barbarians had exceptionally high vitality and strength. They weren't as good at tanking as dwarves, but their bodies were still perfect for the role. After countless experiments, he discovered that a shield-wielding barbarian off-tank was practically broken. So he reached toward the weapon rack and picked up that piece of equipment. When the chief saw his choice, surprise flashed across his face. That's right, he'd chosen the shield because he knew it was the strongest starting weapon available. After completing the coming-of-age ceremony, the young barbarian warriors had to immediately travel to Raftonia, the city that housed the labyrinth. As the city gates opened, all the barbarians roared and charged inside. He had no choice but to follow them into the city. Watching the barbarians blindly charge ahead, he suddenly wondered if any of them actually knew the way. Sure enough, the barbarian leading the group suddenly stopped and proudly announced, "I got lost." Everyone immediately declared that Karak, third son of Fanun, was no longer qualified to lead them. Karak admitted that he wasn't capable and willingly gave up the position. Next, Einar, second daughter of Penelin, took over as the group's guide. He frowned at Einar's confident expression. Could this woman really be trusted? Predictably, disaster struck again. They got lost for a second time. All the barbarians immediately blamed Einar because they had to reach the labyrinth within the time limit. At this rate, they might not make it in time, but he didn't want to draw attention to himself so soon. So he turned his gaze toward the dejected Einar standing nearby. He walked over and called out to her, but Einar assumed he'd come to blame her too. Instead, he motioned for her to lower her voice and told her he knew how to find the right path. Then he pointed toward a party of human adventurers in the distance. All they had to do was follow those adventurers, and they'd be led straight to the labyrinth entrance. Einar finally understood what he meant. Thanks to his suggestion, the group reached the labyrinth entrance before time ran out. But the moment he stood before the entrance, he began wondering whether entering the labyrinth was really the right choice. The world of Dungeon and Stone had one particularly vicious mechanic called taxes. Every adult resident had to pay on time, and anyone who failed was executed. There were plenty of ways to earn money, but two were far more common than the rest. The first was entering the labyrinth and fighting monsters. The second was working at a tavern or another business in the city. The problem was that he was a barbarian. No one would hire a clumsy barbarian for an easy job. That was why barbarians were the only race given a weapon at the start. Worse yet, the labyrinth only opened once a month. Only 10 minutes remained before the entrance closed. If he missed it, he'd have to wait an entire month, making this his best chance to enter. But his fear of death kept him rooted in place. After all, this wasn't a game anymore. Just then, a voice suddenly came from behind him. "Bjorn, son of Yandel." He turned around and saw Einar. Einar quickly said, "Everyone else has already gone inside. We're the only two left, so we need to hurry." He looked toward the portal and saw that the entrance was indeed shrinking. So he told Einar to go in first and promised to follow right behind her. Einar agreed. But just before entering the portal, she suddenly stopped and turned around. She thanked him for helping her earlier, then asked how she could become as smart as him. After all, she'd never met such an intelligent barbarian before. He stared at her speechlessly and thought that she'd probably need to be reborn. Instead, he brushed her off with some simple advice. No matter what you do, always think before you act. Einar took his words completely seriously and promised, "If I make it out of the labyrinth alive, I'll repay you." Her wording caught him off guard, so he asked, "Are you afraid of dying?" Einar answered without hesitation, "Isn't that obvious? Death is terrifying, but we were born warriors. If we don't fight, we can only wait to die. Aren't you the same?" Her words finally helped him make up his mind. These barbarians were no different from him. They had simply found a way to overcome their fear so they could survive. He was a barbarian now too. He was still terrified, but he had no choice except to fight. Besides, he had 9 years of character building experience. He was certain he could survive in this world. He'd assumed his gaming experience would make everything go smoothly. But the moment he entered the labyrinth, he found himself in a completely unfamiliar area, surrounded by absolute darkness. He immediately searched through his memories of the game. According to the game's rules, glowing crystals embedded in the walls of the first floor should have provided plenty of light. Yet no matter where he looked, he couldn't see a single glimmer. Then a terrifying possibility struck him. Had he spawned inside a dark zone? Only a tiny number of areas along the outer edge of the first floor had no light sources. He immediately tried to summon the game's system interface. But even after several attempts, nothing happened. With no other choice, he held his shield in one hand, felt along the wall with the other, and moved in a single direction. He carefully felt his way forward, but his pace was even slower than crawling. Then, disaster struck. His right foot snapped into a hidden metal trap. The sudden pain made him scream at the top of his lungs, but almost immediately, he realized he couldn't make another sound. There was only one monster on the first floor that used traps. Goblins. That meant one of them had to be nearby, watching him from the darkness. He carefully scanned his surroundings, but nothing moved. Could the goblin have wandered away? He gritted his teeth and forced himself upright. Maybe the creature really had left for a moment. Still, he refused to lower his guard. Even if the goblin hadn't been nearby before, it must have heard his scream. It could be hiding in the darkness right now, waiting for its prey to grow weak. He took a deep breath and used both hands to pry open the trap coated in paralyzing poison. Once he pulled himself free, he realized his right foot was already going numb from the poison. He immediately raised his shield and prepared to fight. Then, he began shouting taunts into the darkness, hoping to force the goblin to reveal itself. But the goblin was far more cunning than he'd expected, and refused to appear. So he deliberately called out, "Fine, I'm leaving, you can keep hiding." As he dragged his injured foot forward, he cursed the goblin and its entire family. That was when he finally heard footsteps behind him. He looked back, but saw nothing except darkness, so he quickened his pace, pretending that he was desperately trying to escape. Then he suddenly stopped and spun around. The goblin's footsteps stopped as well. Only then did he realize the creature was keeping a fixed distance from him. Whenever he stopped, the goblin stopped too. The more its prey bled, the more excited it became, until the victim finally died in terror, so he immediately changed his strategy. He dragged his injured leg forward for a few more steps, then staggered and collapsed. He made himself look completely exhausted and thought, "There, just what you wanted." The goblin hesitated when it saw him fall. Then it picked up a rock and threw it at him, checking whether he was truly dead. He cursed inwardly. This little bastard even knew to test its prey with a rock. It was unbelievably cunning. When he still didn't react, the goblin finally lowered its guard and slowly approached. Just as the goblin reached him and prepared to deliver the finishing blow, he exploded to his feet and drove his fist straight at the creature. But he'd misjudged the distance, causing his punch to miss completely. When the goblin saw him swing at nothing, a mocking grin spread across its face. However, that mocking expression awakened the combat instincts buried within his barbarian body. His body instantly adjusted, allowing him to strike again with incredible speed. This time, he grabbed the goblin and slammed it violently into the ground. Then came one punch, two punches, and three. He unleashed all his rage from being toyed with moments earlier. Once he'd beaten the goblin into a bloody pulp, its body dissolved into a stream of white light. In the spot where it disappeared, a red gemstone had been left behind. He picked it up and recognized it as a magic stone, the currency used in this world. Unfortunately, it was only a 9th rank magic stone, the lowest grade possible. It was worth enough to buy just a single piece of bread. He couldn't help laughing bitterly. He'd nearly died killing that goblin, yet his reward was barely enough to buy one piece of bread. It was frustrating, but that was simply how brutal this world was. This was no longer just the game world he remembered. It was now his reality. He dragged his injured right foot and limped deeper into the labyrinth. As time passed, he completely lost track of how long he'd been moving. To stay alive, he eventually abandoned his human dignity and crawled across the ground like a dog. This allowed him to move faster without putting any weight on his injured foot. Crawling also lowered the risk of stepping into another hidden trap. Even so, the wound on his foot was still bleeding. He had to find someone who could help him as quickly as possible. He remembered that moving in one direction would eventually lead him out of the dark zone, and his surroundings were slowly becoming brighter. The area ahead appeared to be the exit. If he could reach it, he might find one or two adventurers willing to help him. Driven by his desperate will to survive, he finally managed to crawl all the way to the exit. Now he could only hope that a passing adventurer would save his life. When he raised his head, he actually saw a party of adventurers, and they noticed him as well. One of the men walked over and immediately realized that Bjorn was a complete rookie. The man was also surprised that a first-timer had somehow reached this area before their party. But Bjorn was already on the verge of death. He couldn't even gather enough strength to ask for help. Seeing his condition, the man gave him a thoughtful smile. Then he turned to the priest in his party and asked her to heal the rookie. The mention of a priest immediately gave Bjorn hope. A party with its own priest had to be made up of high-ranking adventurers. But just when he thought he was saved, the priest looked at him with disgust and refused to heal him. With no other choice, the man asked another member of the party for a healing potion. After receiving it, he approached Bjorn and warned him, "This might hurt a little." With that, he poured the potion directly onto Bjorn's wound. A wave of unbearable pain tore through Bjorn, making it feel as though his entire body was melting. A few moments later, the wound on his foot had completely healed. Bjorn finally managed to rise slowly to his feet. The man then asked how he'd reached this place and whether he'd discovered a secret passage. If he had, the man was willing to pay for the information. Bjorn immediately realized that the man had saved him for a reason. So he honestly explained that he'd been transported to this area the moment he entered the labyrinth. The man remembered reading about such cases. Apparently, this kind of dimensional instability only occurred once every 100 years. Bjorn was stunned. Just how unlucky did someone have to be to encounter a once-in-a-century disaster on his first day? After getting his answer, the man left with his party and told Bjorn not to worry about repaying the cost of the potion. Bjorn watched them disappear into the distance. Surviving should have been something worth celebrating, but being looked at with pity still felt absolutely terrible. After surviving that brush with death, he quickly figured out the goblins' behavior patterns. Now he was smashing them to death, one after another, with his shield. In a well-lit area, goblins were no longer much of a threat, but his biggest problem now was that he was starving. Earlier, his constant fighting inside the labyrinth had already created several serious problems. The first was food. The ration pouch provided by the tribal chief had torn open, causing 5 days' worth of his 7-day food supply to disappear. He had no choice but to ration what remained. Then the system warned him that he needed water. Water was even more important than food, but the tribal chief hadn't provided any. That meant the labyrinth had to contain natural water sources. Sure enough, it didn't take Bjorn long to find one. He followed the sound of dripping water and eventually discovered a small pond. An adventurer was already drinking there. Aside from the blonde man's party, this was the first explorer Bjorn had encountered. But the moment the adventurer spotted him from a distance, he turned around and left. He probably wanted nothing to do with a barbarian covered in blood. After drinking his fill and resting for a while, Bjorn finally had time to count his loot. He'd collected 44 magic stones, which were worth roughly 44 pieces of bread. Considering he'd nearly died fighting his first goblin, he had to admit that he'd been incredibly fortunate. But nothing in this world came free. In exchange for all that fighting, he was now exhausted to the bone. Every living creature needed sleep. But how was he supposed to rest inside a labyrinth crawling with monsters? He had two options. He could trust his life to luck and sleep alone, or find a companion who could take turns keeping watch. The other adventurers were probably just as exhausted as he was. Forming a temporary partnership was clearly the safer choice. After making his decision, he began searching the labyrinth for a night companion. But everyone he approached rejected him. They didn't trust barbarians and considered them unreliable partners. Just as he was becoming frustrated, a human man who appeared to be around 40 approached him with a friendly smile and asked whether he was looking for a night companion. Bjorn was surprised that someone had approached him first, but he was too exhausted to be picky, so he agreed. The experienced-looking man introduced himself as Hans. Then, while shaking Bjorn's hand, he said, 3 people would be ideal for a night watch group, but searching for another member now would only waste more energy. The way Hans suggested that they partner up alone, combined with his slick tone, made Bjorn feel as though someone was trying to take advantage of him. Bjorn quickly pulled his hand away and warned him, "Don't try anything funny." After a brief discussion, they formed a 2-man night companion team. Hans then suggested playing rock, paper, scissors to decide who would sleep first. As expected, Bjorn lost the first round and had to keep watch. Hans even pulled out a watch and patiently explained how to use it. Apparently, people in this world assumed barbarians didn't even know how watches worked. Hans then covered himself with a blanket, used his backpack as a pillow, and started snoring almost immediately. After waiting for 2 hours, it was finally Bjorn's turn to sleep. He found an open spot and lay down, but he only pretended to fall asleep. Hans certainly looked friendly and hadn't shown any intention of hurting him. But Bjorn couldn't bring himself to trust a stranger he'd only just met. Nothing happened during the next 2 hours, yet he remained fully alert throughout his entire resting period. He immediately regretted his decision. He should have slept properly, but now it was Hans's turn to rest again. Bjorn sat nearby and continued wondering whether Hans could be trusted, but his eyelids had become almost impossible to keep open. Suddenly, Hans shook him awake. Only then did Bjorn realize that he'd fallen asleep during his watch. To make up for his mistake, Bjorn offered to let Hans sleep a little longer, but Hans simply forgave him with a warm smile and refused the offer. Yet, the friendlier Hans behaved, the more suspicious Bjorn became. The man had the calculated kindness of an experienced con artist. Hans had been the one who first suggested that they didn't need a third member. He hadn't complained about Bjorn's bloody smell, and he'd even refused the offer of another sleeping shift as compensation. Inside such a brutal labyrinth, showing this much kindness to a complete stranger felt unnatural. When Bjorn lay down again, his thoughts continued to race. Then his body's instincts suddenly screamed that something was wrong, and his eyes snapped open. Hans's smiling face was the first thing he saw. But Hans was holding a massive warhammer above his head with both hands, ready to crush Bjorn's face. At the last second, Bjorn's warrior-trained body instinctively twisted out of the way. When Hans saw that Bjorn had dodged the attack, panic flashed across his face. A wave of murderous rage instantly ignited inside Bjorn. He grabbed his shield and slammed it into Hans with all his strength. After several brutal blows, Hans's face was badly swollen and blood poured from his nose. This man was only slightly stronger than a goblin. No wonder he had to rely on dirty tricks and sneak attacks. Before long, the battered Hans collapsed to his knees. Bjorn slowly approached him and demanded to know why he'd launched the sneak attack. Hans hurriedly claimed that he only wanted Bjorn's shield and magic stones. But Bjorn didn't believe him. Murdering another adventurer inside the labyrinth was a serious crime, and no one would take that risk for such a small amount of loot. When Hans still refused to tell the truth, Bjorn launched a brutal kick straight into his chin. Then he planted his foot on Hans's body and demanded the real reason again. Only then did Hans finally confess in a panic. Barbarian hearts had recently been discovered as a new type of magical material. A single barbarian heart could be exchanged for an enormous reward. That was why Hans had planned to kill Bjorn in his sleep. Hans believed that confessing everything would convince Bjorn to spare his life. But a sweet smile slowly spread across Bjorn's face. Then he raised his shield high and smashed it down onto Hans. A system notification immediately appeared. Achievement unlocked. First murder. Bjorn also looted Hans's massive warhammer, leather boots, pocket watch, backpack, and everything else he carried. His overall combat power increased as well. With that, Bjorn finally escaped his primitive lifestyle. Ironically, killing a man had allowed him to live more like one. After organizing his new supplies, he headed deeper into the labyrinth. Any goblin he encountered along the way could now be killed with a single swing of his hammer. However, the exhaustion weighing on his body continued to grow. This time, he decided to search for another barbarian to serve as his knight companion. But the situation was completely different from the previous day. Every adventurer he encountered actively invited him to join their resting group. After Hans's betrayal, however, Bjorn could no longer bring himself to trust humans. After refusing their invitations, he learned that most barbarians had already advanced to the second floor. That left him with other races. Fairies were known for keeping their promises, while dwarves were as bold and straightforward as barbarians. After wandering through the labyrinth for roughly an hour, he finally discovered a lone member of another race. The instant their eyes met, a suffocating silence filled the area. A pointed-eared fairy girl was sitting with her back against the wall, silently staring at him. She didn't appear to have a knight companion either, and had been dozing off alone. Her cat-like amber eyes shone with confusion and suspicion. Her expression practically begged Bjorn to ignore her and walk away. But contrary to what she wanted, Bjorn's first thought was, I finally found a suitable knight companion. He began examining her condition, causing the nervous fairy girl to rise from the ground. Her posture was clearly unnatural. A long but shallow stab wound stretched across her abdomen, and it wasn't the kind of injury a goblin could inflict. Bjorn asked, "Were you wounded by humans?" The elf girl didn't answer immediately, probably because his massive body looked terrifying. He could understand her reaction. Anyone who was already injured would panic when a huge barbarian approached, especially a young woman. But while he was thinking this, the fairy girl suddenly dropped to her knees. Tears instantly filled her eyes. "Mister, please don't hurt me. I have elderly relatives and a younger brother depending on me. Please let me go." Bjorn froze. How could this fairy have so little backbone? He'd expected her to be the cold and beautiful type, since the fairies he remembered had always seemed ruthless. If he'd known she was this kind of person, he would have approached her more gently, to prevent any further misunderstanding. He gave her a friendly smile and said, "Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you." The eyes were the windows to the soul. Once she had time to calm down, she would surely realize that he meant every word. But before he could finish, the fairy girl became even more frightened and asked, "Do you really have to do this, Mr. Barbarian?" Bjorn nearly lost his mind. What the hell had he done? He felt like some creepy flasher harassing a high school girl outside the school gates. But he was just a normal barbarian. "Please, just this once. Let me go." The longer Bjorn remained silent, the more pitiful the fairy girl looked as she continued begging for mercy. Bjorn was completely speechless. What kind of lives did barbarians lead for their reputation to be this terrible? He sighed and said, "Treat your wound first. We'll talk about everything else later." Then he took a step back, pulled some herbs and bandages from his backpack, and tossed them in front of her. The fairy girl stared at them in confusion. "Are these healing herbs? Why are you giving them to me? Why are you helping me?" Bjorn replied, "Do I need a reason to help someone? The cheesy line made his mouth feel like it was full of thorns, but it was the best way to ease her doubts. Then he explained, "I need a night companion." Asking for something like that in this situation made him sound like a complete creep. However, the arrangement definitely wasn't bad for her. She was injured and severely sleep-deprived. Her striking appearance only made her vulnerable situation several times more dangerous than Bjorn's. Bjorn turned his back and allowed her to treat the wound. It didn't take long before she announced that she was finished, and her bandaging skills were surprisingly good. When she looked at Bjorn again, some of the suspicion in her eyes appeared to have faded. Bjorn used the opportunity to introduce himself. "I'm Bjorn, son of Yandel, a barbarian." The fairy girl quietly replied, "Owen." That had to be her name. Bjorn said, "I don't know what you misunderstood earlier, but nothing you're imagining is going to happen." Owen timidly answered, "Okay." But the fear in her eyes remained. Since she still couldn't lower her guard, Bjorn directly asked why she was so afraid of him. Owen finally explained that barbarians and fairies had been enemies several decades earlier. Although the war had ended long ago, she'd grown up hearing terrifying stories about barbarians. That was why Bjorn frightened her so badly. It was also the first time he'd heard that their races had once been enemies. Owen hurriedly patted her chest and promised, "I don't hold any hatred toward barbarians, and I don't want to fight you." Bjorn looked at her seriously. "I don't mean you any harm either. So will you become my night companion? It'll only be for one night. You're exhausted too, so why don't we help each other?" Owen frowned as she carefully considered his offer. She remembered that barbarians placed great importance on honor, so she asked Bjorn to swear on his warrior's honor that he would never harm her first. Bjorn immediately swore on his warrior's honor. Owen also swore in the name of her tribe that she would never harm him first. With their agreement secured, Bjorn could finally get some proper sleep. He handed Owen the pocket watch and instructed her to wake him in 2 hours. But as a precaution, he still planned to pretend to sleep for the first 10 minutes and observe her reaction. The next thing he knew, Owen's voice woke him. He sat up in a daze and learned that 2 entire hours had already passed. He didn't even know when he'd fallen asleep. Had the combination of the blanket and backpack been so comfortable that he'd passed out the moment he lay down? When it was Owen's turn to rest, Bjorn lent her the blanket. The warmth immediately relaxed her, and she quickly curled up and fell asleep. She must have been completely exhausted. She had probably endured a day just as difficult as Bjorn's. With nothing else to do, Bjorn found himself thinking about the real world. Would anyone search for him? Did anyone even know he was missing? He quickly pushed those thoughts aside. Even if he returned, there was nothing waiting there that he truly wanted. More than an hour passed, leaving only 10 minutes before he needed to wake Owen. Bjorn studied the sleeping fairy girl and wondered whether she could be useful in battle. Perhaps he could eventually turn her into a long-term companion. While he was considering the possibility, 2 human adventurers passed through the area. When they saw Bjorn resting beside a fairy, they approached and asked about his relationship with her. Bjorn gave them a cold look and ordered them to leave. Intimidated by his overwhelming presence, the 2 humans reluctantly backed away. But the way they whispered to each other as they left gave Bjorn a bad feeling. These men were probably searching for Owen. He quickly woke her. "Stop sleeping and get up." But Owen only mumbled, "5 more minutes." Bjorn was speechless. She might lose her life at any moment. Yet she could still fall back asleep. Earlier, when Bjorn told Owen to get up, she'd actually been pretending to sleep. When the 2 humans arrived, Bjorn had secretly checked on her and caught the girl deliberately hiding her face beneath the blanket. She was clearly already awake. Not wanting to waste time arguing, Bjorn grabbed her shoulders and forced her upright. "Why were you pretending to sleep?" The startled Owen mumbled incoherently and guiltily avoided his gaze. Bjorn needed information so he could make a decision as quickly as possible, making her evasive attitude incredibly frustrating. So he grabbed Owen's chin and forced her to look him in the eyes. Owen finally admitted, "Because I was afraid you'd leave me behind the moment I woke up." She was right. They were only temporary partners who took turns keeping watch and protecting each other. The moment Owen opened her eyes, their night companion oath would end. Bjorn released a deep breath, then asked, "What is your relationship with those 2 men who were looking for you?" Owen replied, "I don't know them, but the emblem on their clothing was the same as the man who tried to hurt me. They must belong to the same organization." Bjorn couldn't stop himself from cursing. Their enemy wasn't just 2 people. It was an entire organization, making the situation far worse. He even began wondering whether he should simply leave Owen behind and walk away. But she looked barely 20 years old and was already wounded. He couldn't stop himself from feeling some pity for her. So he decided to take Owen away from the dangerous area first. As they ran, Owen explained the rest of what had happened. On her first night inside the labyrinth, she'd formed a night companion partnership with a human man. But halfway through the night, a strange sound woke her. When she opened her eyes and looked at him, the man had already pulled down his pants and was preparing to assault her. Owen barely managed to escape. But from that moment on, the man's companions attacked her whenever they found her. That was also how she'd received a wound across her abdomen. She later learned from one of her attackers that the man was a leader in an organization called the Crystal Union. Every member carried a message stone. Once attuned to one another, the stones allowed their owners to communicate within a 300-meter radius. That made an already terrible situation even worse. The enemy had plenty of manpower and a way to coordinate their movements. If nothing changed, Owen would eventually be captured, but judging from her story, she didn't appear to have done anything wrong. So why was the entire organization hunting her? When Bjorn asked that crucial question, Owen gave him an innocent look and revealed something shocking. Before escaping, she'd castrated the man who tried to assault her. Bjorn immediately understood why that man was so determined to hunt her down. Just then, Owen suddenly warned him, "Someone is tracking us from behind. They're roughly 150 meters away." She didn't appear to be lying. This had to be the fairy's naturally heightened perception. Bjorn immediately increased their pace, but they still couldn't widen the distance from their pursuer. At this rate, the tracker would use a message stone to relay their location to the entire organization, placing them in even greater danger. Bjorn was still conflicted. If the pursuer had been targeting him, he would have killed the man without hesitation. But this was ultimately Owen's problem. If Bjorn interfered, he might never escape the mess surrounding her. To make his decision quickly, Bjorn asked what she was best at. Owen answered, laundry, cooking, and cleaning. Her answer left Bjorn completely speechless. Realizing her mistake, Owen hurriedly added that her real specialty was archery. She could also use fire attribute magic. Owen was a standard archer with the addition of a valuable fire attribute. Her combat abilities could clearly help Bjorn explore the labyrinth. So Bjorn asked seriously, "Do you want to become my real companion? The partnership will last until this labyrinth run ends. We'll split the loot 9-1. I get 90% and you get 10. Before Bjorn could explain his remaining conditions, Owen shouted, "I accept, I accept." Meanwhile, the pursuer behind them was rapidly closing the distance. Just then, Bjorn spotted a dark cave passage ahead. He immediately ordered Owen to use her fire magic and illuminate the way. Once they were deep inside the cave, Bjorn told her to extinguish the flame. Before long, the relentless pursuer appeared at the cave entrance. Luring the tracker into this location had been Bjorn's true purpose. Owen had already drawn her bow and prepared to attack. The instant the pursuer entered her range, she released the bowstring without hesitation and fired an arrow. But Bjorn could clearly feel Owen's entire body trembling beside him. After all, this was probably the first person she'd ever killed. Bjorn stepped out of the darkness and began inspecting the pursuer's corpse. To move as quickly as possible, the tracker hadn't carried a backpack. The most important item on his body was a single message stone. Voices were still coming through the stone. When no one on this end responded, the other members quickly realized that something was wrong. Finally, a message came through. "The tracker has been killed. Everyone receiving this message, gather in the Goblin District immediately." By then, Bjorn had already removed every useful piece of equipment from the corpse and begun sorting through the loot. He'd expected to find something valuable, but there was only a heavy pouch of magic stones, 2 daggers, a crossbow, and the complete set of equipment the tracker had been wearing. Owen changed into the new equipment. It was slightly too large, but after tightening the belt, it fit her well enough. Perhaps it was the change of clothing, but her entire presence seemed different. Now she finally looked like a proper female warrior. While Bjorn examined the message stone, the leader of the Crystal Union spoke again. "Certain, the man pursuing the fairy is dead. Her current location is the Goblin District. She's traveling with a savage man carrying a warhammer and shield. Anyone who captures them will receive a bounty of 10,000 stones." Even Bjorn was surprised by such a massive bounty. Owen immediately looked up at him with anxious eyes. Bjorn calmly reassured her, "Don't worry, I'll get you out of here." The determination in his eyes instantly turned Owen into his devoted admirer. Bjorn had already decided to help Owen when he killed the tracker. The reason was simple: he liked helping people in trouble, provided they were useful to him. Using Owen's flame as their light, they set out for the labyrinth's second floor. Along the way, Bjorn explained their situation to her. As long as they stayed near the second floor entrance, the two of them shouldn't face too much danger. Bjorn also pointed out that they worked extremely well together. Close-range and long-range fighters were a perfect combination. Besides, the loot from the first floor was nowhere near enough for 2 people. While Owen was still worried about going to the second floor, a disgusting message came through the message stone. Whoever captured the elf would receive 10,000 gold and first dibs on her. The message couldn't have come at a better time. Now Bjorn wouldn't have to keep convincing her. According to Bjorn's memories of the game, anyone who didn't know the route could find the entrance by continuing north. After walking for some time, they finally discovered their first goblin trap, though it had appeared much later than Bjorn expected. Judging by what had happened when he first entered the labyrinth, they should have encountered one much sooner. Were goblins simply less common in areas without light? The thought left Bjorn deeply frustrated. He'd been dropped into the dark zone, stepped on a trap, and nearly died. Just how terrible could his luck possibly be? Owen seemed to view this as her chance to prove herself, so she confidently stepped in front of Bjorn. The instant a group of goblins leaped out, she nimbly dodged their attacks, then fired her arrows at point-blank range, and easily killed several goblins. Her combat skills were far better than Bjorn had expected, and her movements were remarkably agile. Once every goblin was dead, Owen looked back at Bjorn with a smug, triumphant smile. Bjorn praised her. "Nice work. Your archery is exactly what I'd expect from an elf." Owen immediately became bashful, but she couldn't hide her happiness. She then held out her small hand. 2 magic stones rested in her palm. She still remembered the loot-sharing terms Bjorn had proposed while they were escaping. Owen confidently declared that, at this rate, she might actually make a fortune. After they traveled in silence for a while, another message came through the message stone. This time, the bounty had risen to 20,000 gold. That meant enemies had to be somewhere within 300 meters. Perhaps sensing trouble instinctively, Owen quietly moved closer to Bjorn. With Bjorn's unbelievably terrible luck, something bad should have happened by now. But the quieter their surroundings became, the more uneasy he felt. Just as he expected, Owen suddenly pointed ahead and cried out. When she moved her flame forward, Bjorn finally saw a horde of zombies with rotting skin and empty eyes. According to his memories, these monsters should only appear in the southern region. Had they wandered near the boundary? Although they had tried to keep heading north, every dead end forced them to change direction. They might have accidentally started traveling the opposite way. Owen's earlier confidence vanished, and she timidly hid behind Bjorn. After outlining the basic strategy for her, Bjorn slowly stepped forward. 3 zombies blocked the passage ahead. If they behaved as they had in the game, they wouldn't attack until he entered a certain range. The moment Bjorn carefully took one more step, all 3 zombies lunged at him. They were stronger than goblins, but they were still only rank 9 monsters. Defeating them would be easy enough, especially now that Bjorn had a dependable partner. The pair continued fighting, leveling up, and heading north. Before they knew it, the 3rd day had passed. That was when Owen discovered a dark red trail of blood on the ground. It was definitely blood, but it didn't appear to have come from a goblin. The trail also led exactly where they were headed. For some reason, Bjorn felt as though he already knew who the blood belonged to. After following the trail for a while, he became even more certain of his guess. A discarded sandal and a familiar trap lay directly ahead. Bjorn couldn't stop himself from cursing. The entrance to the 2nd floor had been directly behind him when he first entered the labyrinth. This had to be some kind of choke. If only he had gone the other way back then. If only he hadn't stepped on that trap. His luck truly was unbelievably awful. The instant they stepped through the gate to the 2nd floor, their bodies suddenly plunged from high above. It felt as though a frog had chewed Bjorn repeatedly, before spitting him out in disgust. With a heavy thud, Bjorn crashed hard onto the ground. Owen quickly regained her balance and landed without a scratch. Bjorn was once again impressed by her physical abilities. She possessed a level of agility that a barbarian like him could never have. At the same time, they heard a system notification announcing that they had entered the 2nd floor. After examining their surroundings, Bjorn used his memories of the game to identify this place as the Goblin Forest in the northern region of the 2nd floor. Behind them was a passage that could take them back to the 1st floor at any time. There were no living creatures nearby, and each entrance on this floor led to a different monster territory. The northern entrance led to the Goblin Forest. The eastern entrance led to the Beast's Nest. The western entrance led to the Zombie territory. The southern entrance led to Black Rock Mountain. To return to the city, adventurers simply had to wait until the designated time, when the labyrinth would spit everyone back out. The disorganized group pursuing them was unlikely to follow them to the 2nd floor, so Bjorn decided to remain there until the very end, then return before the 1st floor closed. But They couldn't simply sit around and wait, so they decided to explore the surrounding area. Perhaps because they were inside a forest, Owen remarked that it felt like she had returned to the elves' territory. Even though she knew they were surrounded by goblins, she was still as excited as a child. She also made full use of an elf's heightened perception, moving ahead of Bjorn and clearing the goblin traps in their path. Something felt strange, however. The area was filled with traps, yet there wasn't a single goblin in sight. Unlike on the first floor, the goblins here usually traveled in groups of more than a dozen. In addition to setting fixed traps, their groups could even include mutated goblin archers. The closer one traveled toward the forest's outer reaches, a more mutated species would appear. However, Bjorn and Owen planned to remain near the entrance, so those mutated goblins weren't an immediate threat. They threw stones to trigger the traps and gradually expanded their safe zone, ensuring that nothing would hinder them if they needed to escape. Once the safe zone had grown large enough, Owen detected a group of goblins ahead. When she looked at him for instructions, Bjorn decided to eliminate them. Owen carefully parted the bushes and crept toward the goblins. Despite the branches and vegetation covering the ground, her footsteps made no sound at all. Bjorn was once again amazed by the incredible agility of an elf. Before long, Owen came to a stop. She turned and waved to Bjorn, signaling that she had found the targets. At Bjorn's command, she immediately raised her bow and took aim at the goblins. The instant her arrow flew, Bjorn charged forward. The monsters on the second floor truly were different. For one thing, there were 3 times as many as on the first floor. There were also new enemies, such as goblin archers. But to Bjorn's surprise, he felt no fear at all. Instead, excitement surged through his entire body. The barbarian body's natural hunger for battle had awakened. As the goblins charged him from the front, Bjorn tightened his grip on his short hammer and smashed it into their temples. Every swing sent another weak goblin flying. Some of them turned into light and disappeared before they even hit the ground. But it was still too early to celebrate. They had only eliminated the few goblins at the front. More goblins attacked from every direction, but the strongest sense of danger came from behind Bjorn. It was a goblin swordsman. If Bjorn had reacted even a moment later, he could have lost his head. The monsters gave him no chance to breathe. Normally, even 5 ordinary goblins would already pose a serious threat. If Bjorn had been alone against this horde, he would have needed to accept being wounded just to have a chance of winning. But things were different now because Bjorn had a reliable companion. An arrow suddenly flew from the bushes and pierced straight through a goblin's forehead. Owen had clearly secured the perfect sniping position. Bjorn quickly rose from the ground, raised his shield, and charged back into the center of the enemy formation. It was time to finish this fight. Before long, they eliminated the first group of goblins and collected 11 red magic stones. Compared to the 44 magic stones Bjorn had gathered after fighting all day on the first floor, this was already an excellent result. The only disappointment was that the goblin swordsman's equipment vanished along with its body. Still, Bjorn couldn't help wondering how much loot they might collect after spending 4 days here. Soon afterward, they expanded their exploration radius to 3 kilometers around the passage leading back to the first floor. Along the way, they encountered one goblin group after another, with a new group appearing roughly every 5 minutes of travel. Some of these groups included highly dangerous goblin archers that could even use invisibility magic. However, as long as Bjorn remained fully focused, he still had a chance to respond. The moment a goblin archer revealed itself, he could react to the incoming arrow in time. Even a barbarian would die instantly if an arrow pierced his head. If Bjorn made it back to the city alive, buying a helmet had to be his first priority. The pair soon finished another battle. Afterward, they found an open area and decided to recover their stamina before continuing their exploration. Bjorn asked whether Owen wanted to sleep first, and the girl accepted without the slightest hesitation. Bjorn set down his heavy pack and handed her the blanket. Within a minute, soft snoring came from Owen. Compared to a barbarian's thunderous snoring, hers sounded remarkably delicate. She must have been completely exhausted. Until now, Owen had never made a sound while sleeping. Perhaps she could sleep so deeply because she felt safer than ever before. They had already been hunting for 15 hours straight, facing more than 10 goblins in nearly every battle. But as their teamwork improved, dangerous situations became less frequent, and they eliminated their enemies much faster. As a result, they collected a considerable amount of loot. Of course, there were still tense moments. As their exploration radius expanded, they began encountering adventurer parties with at least 3 members, including several mixed-race groups. Whenever 2 parties met, they would usually keep their distance and pass without interfering with each other. Even so, every encounter left Bjorn mentally exhausted. He feared a surprise attack from adventurers far more than he feared goblins. Now, he had another reason to remain especially cautious. Owen was far too beautiful. Bjorn looked at the peacefully sleeping Owen and let out a sigh. Despite sleeping outdoors for several days, her long, silver hair, captivating amber eyes, and delicate features still made her stand out. Bjorn could only hope her beauty wouldn't attract other male adventurers. But the moment he muttered those words, Owen opened her large eyes with a playful grin and excitedly asked, "Am I really that beautiful?" She still appeared half asleep. After Bjorn coldly denied it, she closed her eyes and immediately began snoring again. After they entered the Goblin Forest, the 4th, 5th, and 6th days quickly passed. It was now the 7th and final day. They had finally survived long enough to leave the labyrinth, with 2 hours and 47 minutes remaining before the first floor entrance closed. There was only one way to leave the labyrinth and return to the city. Wait for the entrance to close completely. At the designated time, the labyrinth would drag every adventurer on that floor back to the city. In other words, the higher the floor, the longer adventurers could remain inside. However, Bjorn and Owen planned to return to the first floor and leave before the 7th day ended. Bjorn had several reasons for wanting to leave early. Once the time limit on the first floor expired, the passage leading there would disappear, potentially cutting off their escape route without warning. Their food was also running low. They could trade magic stones with other adventurers for supplies, but that would only introduce unnecessary risks. More importantly, Owen had fewer than 10 arrows remaining, leaving them unprepared for any unexpected battle. After hunting for a little longer, they checked how much time remained. They then began returning to the first floor entrance, which was currently about 4 kilometers away. As they retraced their path, they discovered newly formed traps throughout the forest. This meant the goblin groups they had previously eliminated had respawned. Just then, Owen stopped at the front and spotted another group of goblins nearby. The two companions didn't need to exchange many words. Once Bjorn nodded, Owen slipped through the bushes as usual to find a suitable position, while Bjorn charged directly toward the goblins. When Bjorn roared from the center of the enemy group, the goblins actually hesitated. They had clearly been intimidated by his overwhelming presence. During that brief hesitation, Bjorn swung his short hammer and crushed the goblin swordsman's head with a single blow. After surviving so many brutal battles, Bjorn had unknowingly mastered the basics of fighting multiple enemies. At the same time, Owen's combat abilities had also been steadily improving. The 2 goblin archers in the group were killed by Owen before they could fire a single arrow, greatly shortening the battle. Just as they were preparing to collect the loot and leave, Owen discovered something strange nearby. It was a glowing orb the size of a fist, floating in midair. Although Bjorn had never seen one in person, he immediately recognized it as a goblin essence, a priceless treasure most adventurers could only dream of finding. The effects of an essence varied by type, and it could grant the person who absorbed it either an active skill or a passive skill. The type of essence an adventurer absorbed could determine their entire future. Although each adventurer could absorb only one essence, countless people were still willing to risk their lives for one. This one happened to be a goblin archer essence. Seeing the longing in Owen's eyes, Bjorn decided to give her this opportunity. But instead of celebrating this sudden stroke of luck, Bjorn felt an ominous premonition. After all, nothing but misfortune had followed him until now. Just as he thought his miserable luck had finally begun to improve, several unwelcome voices called out nearby. The newcomers shamelessly claimed they had spotted the essence first and ordered Bjorn and Owen to put it down and leave. They were a party of 4 human adventurers. The moment they spotted Bjorn, their expressions hardened, and they quickly closed the distance. Strangely, Bjorn felt a familiar sense of relief when he saw them approaching. As expected, his luck was still as terrible as ever. Bjorn immediately raised his middle finger at them. Apparently, this universal gesture worked just as well inside a game world. Owen immediately reached for her weapon, preparing to fight. Before she could draw it, Bjorn grabbed her and threw her forward. Owen's body collided with the floating goblin essence, causing it to erupt with brilliant light. The light wrapped around Owen's body before slowly merging into her. By the time the 4 adventurers arrived, Owen had already absorbed the essence. They immediately pointed at the pair and began cursing. Bjorn calmly took a large step toward them and declared, "If you want to fight, then come at me. I don't care how many of you there are." Although he was outnumbered, Bjorn displayed an even fiercer desire to fight. In this world, anyone who appeared weak would immediately be devoured. Faced with Bjorn's aggressive stance, the 4 adventurers ultimately chose to leave. Bjorn then ordered Owen to reach the first floor entrance as quickly as possible. He couldn't be certain whether the group would follow them, but he knew their destination was also the first floor entrance. A 4-person party was more than strong enough to operate comfortably on the second floor, yet they had been wandering near the entrance. They were clearly planning to return to the city on the 7th day as well. After hearing Bjorn's analysis, Owen asked no unnecessary questions and immediately increased her speed while leading the way. She seemed to understand that even without a direct confrontation, danger would remain until they safely escaped the labyrinth. Just then, Owen detected another group of goblins. Bjorn initially planned to avoid them and continue toward the first floor entrance, but Owen urgently warned him that the goblins were already charging straight toward them. Since entering the second floor, they had always used Owen's heightened perception to avoid goblins before being noticed. The monsters had never attacked them first, so this abnormal behavior couldn't be a coincidence. Just as Bjorn prepared to retreat in the opposite direction, an arrow suddenly tore through the air toward the back of his head. Its speed and power were nothing like a shot fired by a goblin archer. Bjorn immediately realized that the adventurers from earlier must have deliberately lured the goblins toward them. They were probably waiting in ambush in the opposite direction, planning to let the goblins weaken Bjorn and Owen before finishing them off. After reaching that conclusion, Bjorn decided to eliminate the goblins first. He immediately told Owen to use the essence skill she had just acquired. Based on the game's mechanics, the Goblin Archer essence should have granted her invisibility. The skill required no special activation and could be triggered by thought alone. Bjorn sent the invisible Owen to locate the 4 adventurers while he remained behind to face the goblins alone. Given their current situation, it was the only workable plan. Seeing the concern in Owen's eyes, Bjorn instructed her, "I'll give you a signal later. When I do, kill their archer with 1 shot. Until then, don't break your invisibility." Before the bewildered Owen could respond, Bjorn turned and ran back the way they had come. Before long, he spotted the pursuing goblin horde. Bjorn still had no idea where those bastards were hiding. They hadn't revealed themselves since firing that single surprise arrow. They were probably waiting for Bjorn to finish fighting the goblins before showing themselves. That might have been their plan from the beginning. There were roughly a dozen goblins ahead, including 2 goblin swordsmen. However, no arrows had been fired yet. That meant the goblin archers were also hiding somewhere nearby. Bjorn now had to evade the goblin archers while remaining alert for the human archer. At the same time, he still had to slaughter the group of monsters directly in front of him. Whenever Bjorn blocked an arrow from the front with his shield, a goblin archer hiding behind him seized the opportunity to shoot at his back. Without Owen's support, injury was unavoidable if Bjorn wanted to fight all these monsters alone. Although the number of goblins continued to decrease, Bjorn's wounds kept accumulating. After a desperate struggle, Bjorn finally gained a brief chance to catch his breath. But at that exact moment, 2 arrows flew toward him simultaneously from the front and rear. One came from a goblin archer, while the other was clearly the work of those bastards. There was no possible way for Bjorn to block both arrows at once. He chose to block the arrow coming from the side because the sound it made was completely different from a goblin archer's shot. As Bjorn blocked the human's arrow with his shield, the arrow from behind buried itself deep in his left arm. That single hit completely paralyzed his left arm. The arrow had pierced his elbow and was coated with a powerful poison. Only Bjorn's right arm remained usable. If he had to choose between his short hammer and his shield, he'd choose the shield without hesitation. His true enemies weren't the goblins in front of him, but the bastards hiding nearby. The hammer could easily crush the goblins, but it couldn't protect him from hidden arrows. When only 3 goblins remained, they finally seemed to sense how terrifying Bjorn was. Instead of fighting to the death, they turned and fled. Although his body was covered in wounds, Bjorn had won the first round. At the same time, the bastards emerged from the forest while offering him mocking praise. Only 3 of them appeared, which meant the enemy archer was still hiding. Bjorn could only hope Owen had already found him. Bjorn showed no panic at their appearance and merely stared at them with an icy gaze. Even the slightest movement sent pain to his left arm, but it was finally time to give Owen the signal. To ensure Owen immediately recognized it as a signal, Bjorn needed to use a sufficiently distinctive gesture. He raised his right hand and gave them the universally recognized gesture of friendship. A moment later, the red-haired man exchanged glances with his companions and took a large step forward. He declared that they would tame Bjorn first, then force him to reveal Owen's location. Apparently, they intended to treat Bjorn like a massive raid boss from the game. At that moment, Bjorn slowly raised his injured left hand and extended his middle finger, giving them a standard international gesture. The gesture immediately startled the 3 men, leaving their eyes filled with confusion. but the signal brought no response, and Owen's arrow never appeared. Was she too far away to see it? Bjorn couldn't afford to worry about that. He gripped his weapon and charged toward the red-haired man first. The moment Bjorn targeted him, the red-haired man began retreating while desperately calling out a companion's name. A man wearing a straw hat immediately stepped forward and blocked Bjorn's attack. The straw-hatted warrior possessed tremendous strength. He was probably the strongest member of the entire party, but no matter how powerful the man was, Bjorn couldn't afford to retreat. Owen would only have a chance to land a decisive shot if Bjorn completely disrupted their formation. Just as that thought crossed his mind, an arrow suddenly tore through the air. The unexpected shot startled everyone on the battlefield. However, the man wielding a sword and shield managed to block the arrow. No wonder he had remained motionless on the sidelines. He had been watching for Owen. The shield wielder immediately shouted for the others to focus on defeating Bjorn, while he handled Owen's arrows. Those bastards had clearly prepared a detailed battle plan in advance. At the same time, the red-haired man behind Bjorn cunningly swung his sword at Bjorn's injured left arm. Fortunately, Bjorn reacted in time, so the wound wasn't too deep. However, his left arm was now completely unusable. Bjorn abandoned any attempt to protect his left arm. He charged recklessly toward the red-haired man, trading another injury to his left arm for a chance to close the distance. It wasn't a bad exchange. At the same time, Bjorn swung his shield with all his strength and knocked the straw-hatted warrior aside. Just then, Owen fired another supporting arrow. Perhaps she had changed her sniping position, because this shot carried far more power than the previous one. The arrow was also infused with fire magic. Unable to withstand the spreading flames, the shield wielder was forced to throw away his burning shield. The instant that troublesome shield disappeared, Owen fired again without hesitation. This time, her arrow struck the shield wielder directly in the shoulder. The injury caused the sword in his right hand to fall to the ground. With both weapons gone, the shield wielder had become completely useless. When the red-haired man realized the battle was turning against them, he finally reacted. He ordered the straw-hatted warrior to keep Bjorn occupied, then ran toward the forest to search for Owen. Bjorn was trapped by the enemy in front of him, so he could only trust Owen to protect herself. Bjorn immediately raised his shield and slammed it toward the straw-hatted warrior. Instead of blocking the attack, the straw-hatted warrior quickly dodged aside. Bjorn followed through with his momentum and charged toward the unarmed shield wielder behind him, crushing the man's skull with a single blow. Now the straw-hatted warrior truly was the only enemy left in front of Bjorn. After exchanging several blows, Bjorn could clearly feel the warrior's tremendous strength. He couldn't understand why someone so powerful had chosen to associate with those insects, but joining them would become the greatest mistake of the straw-hatted warrior's life. When Bjorn attacked with his shield again, the straw-hatted warrior skillfully retreated and created distance between them. But Bjorn had already anticipated that response. He released his shield and reached for the man with his right hand. The straw-hatted warrior looked utterly confused when Bjorn suddenly grabbed him by the collar. He had clearly never expected Bjorn to abandon his shield. Using the full strength of his right arm, Bjorn violently pulled the warrior toward him. Then he used his teeth in place of his useless left arm and tore open the warrior's throat. The straw-hatted warrior couldn't even scream before leaving this world forever. The moment Bjorn's battle ended, Owen emerged from the forest, breathing heavily. Bjorn spat the flesh from his mouth onto the ground and wiped his lips with his forearm. Owen appeared completely unharmed, meaning she had successfully dealt with the red-haired man. The battle was finally over, but their victory had come at a heavy cost. Owen anxiously stared at the wounded barbarian before her, tears already gathering in her eyes. She hurriedly removed a potion from her waist and held it out to Bjorn. Bjorn said nothing more. He took the potion and swallowed it in one gulp. Before long, he felt something boiling inside his body, as intense pain spread through every blood vessel. Then every inch of his skin began itching so violently that it nearly drove him insane. Fortunately, the sensation quickly disappeared. Bjorn then asked Owen for the time, and learned that fewer than 40 minutes remained before the first floor entrance closed. The situation was too urgent for Bjorn to worry about anything else, so he shouted at Owen, "Hurry up and strip everything off." Owen clearly misunderstood him because she blushed and began removing her own clothes. Bjorn stared at her in disbelief and quickly explained, "I didn't mean your clothes. Strip all the equipment off the bodies." By the time they finished looting every corpse, only a little over 30 minutes remained. From that moment onward, they had no choice but to begin a desperate race against time. After running at full speed for a while, The passage leading to the first floor finally appeared ahead. With fewer than 40 seconds remaining, the pair successfully rushed through the first floor entrance. Returning to the first floor felt almost identical to entering the second floor. Bjorn once again landed in an awkward heap on the ground, while Owen stood nearby without a scratch. Owen looked as happy as a child and excitedly shouted, "That was so much fun." Bjorn thought that if he had someone as reliable as himself by his side, he would probably be just as happy as Owen. He stretched his aching body and slowly rose from the ground. With fewer than 10 seconds remaining, the two simply stood there, looking at each other. Bjorn had planned to say goodbye that way, but he suddenly remembered that they hadn't divided the loot. He quickly thought of a meeting place and shouted, "The Black Whale Tavern. Meet me there after we get out." The moment he finished speaking, brilliant white light swallowed their vision. At the same time, a system notification rang out. "The labyrinth is closing. Your character is being transferred to the city of Rafdonia." When his vision returned, Bjorn found himself staring blankly at the sky. It had been a long time since he had seen sunlight this bright. But before he could enjoy its warmth, the surrounding noise shattered the peaceful moment and made him wonder whether he had been transported somewhere else. Only after hearing the conversations around him did Bjorn gradually accept that he was truly back in the city outside the labyrinth. Every adventurer from the first floor had been gathered in one place, and there were far more of them than he had imagined. Bjorn first adjusted his pocket watch to 12 noon. Time flowed differently inside the labyrinth, and no matter how long someone remained there, only one day passed in the city. That meant every adventurer returned at noon the following day. The moment he finished adjusting the time, Bjorn heard a familiar voice calling out to him. The innocent-looking eyes and booming voice immediately seemed familiar. Bjorn recognized the man, but couldn't remember his name until the man introduced himself again. He was Karak, third son of Fanun. In this world, every barbarian's full name consisted of their father's name, their birth order, and their own name. Before they could exchange more than a few words, barbarians began appearing from every direction. The scene resembled a class reunion as they ignored the surrounding crowd, shouted each other's lengthy names at deafening volume, exchanged greetings, and praised one another's equipment. They all looked rather dim-witted, yet somehow remembered those incredibly long names perfectly. Karak then announced that they were going to exchange their magic stones for gold, and asked whether Bjorn wanted to join them. Bjorn cleared his throat and answered as loudly as possible, "I'm coming too." But Karak merely remarked that he looked exhausted. Karak also pointed out that Bjorn's voice lacked strength. Bjorn had believed his barbarian performance was nearly perfect, but that single comment instantly shattered his confidence. With Karak leading the way, the group headed to the appraisal center. Apparently, visiting this place was necessary whenever the barbarians wanted to compare what they had earned inside the labyrinth. Karak continued bellowing from the front, declaring that he would prove his courage as a warrior. The appraisal center resembled a supermarket checkout area, with adventurers lined up and waiting for their loot to be processed. The woman behind the counter moved her hands like a machine as she rapidly converted everything into gold. Karak's abilities were genuinely impressive. While the other barbarian warriors earned only a little over 20,000 gold, he exchanged his loot for more than 40,000. The other barbarians immediately crowded around Karak and praised him as one of the finest warriors among them. Bjorn slowly approached the counter and placed the 3 storage bags he had prepared in front of the clerk. Thanks to the woman's astonishingly fast hands, Bjorn's earnings were quickly calculated. The total came to 182,413 gold. The moment that number was announced, every barbarian warrior crowded around Bjorn. More than 180,000 gold was the highest amount any of them had ever earned during the ceremony. Then, someone noticed that Bjorn was also carrying a war hammer, battle boots, shoulder armor, and other equipment. The impressive spoils immediately filled everyone with envy. Bjorn could understand their excitement. He had entered the labyrinth practically naked, and returned as a fully equipped, civilized barbarian. He was probably the first to accomplish such a feat. As the others showered him with excessive praise, the barbarian blood inside Bjorn began surging with excitement. "I am the greatest warrior." The moment Bjorn roared those words, the surrounding barbarian warriors erupted into a frenzy. However, their minds were simple, so their excitement arrived quickly and faded just as fast. Before long, everyone sat together in the center of the plaza. Bjorn worried that there might be another beginner procedure he didn't know about, so he remained with the group and waited for the other barbarians. That was when Bjorn spotted Owen, surrounded by a group of handsome men and beautiful women, excitedly talking with them. The sight filled Bjorn with envy. After all, he was surrounded by nothing but massive, muscular barbarian men. Just then, Owen secretly glanced toward Bjorn. When their eyes met, Bjorn seized the opportunity and silently mouthed, "See you tonight." Bjorn couldn't tell whether Owen had truly understood, but her face immediately turned red as she mouthed back, "Okay." At that moment, a female elf beside Owen and Carrick beside Bjorn simultaneously asked in surprise, "Do you two know each other?" Bjorn had barely answered no when Carrick shouted, "You're the greatest warrior. How could you possibly know those despicable elves?" At that moment, Bjorn desperately wanted to cover Carrick's mouth, but it was already too late. Carrick's voice was so loud that every elf nearby turned and glared at them. These simple-minded barbarians were driving Bjorn insane. Fortunately, the last few barbarian warriors finished exchanging their loot and emerged from the appraisal center at that exact moment. Since remaining there wouldn't give him another chance to speak with Owen anyway, Bjorn decided to lead the barbarians away. After traveling a short distance, Bjorn witnessed a heartbreaking scene. Although he had played this game countless times, he had never imagined that such powerful emotions existed inside its real world. There was the joy of families and friends welcoming adventurers home safely. There was also the grief of those who realized their loved ones would never return. These were scenes Bjorn could never have witnessed through a computer screen. Now that he was facing them in person, his heart became unbearably heavy. Before long, Bjorn found himself staring blankly at the group of lunatics around him. There was only one reason he had continued traveling with them. He was afraid there might be another beginner quest he knew nothing about. But he never expected their next destination to be a tavern, where the barbarians planned to start drinking in broad daylight and continue until they passed out. Remaining with them would only waste his time, so Bjorn suddenly stood and announced that he had somewhere else to be. The others immediately began shouting in disbelief, insisting that Bjorn was the guest of honor and couldn't leave. But Bjorn refused to change his mind, so they could only watch helplessly as he walked away. After separating from the barbarians, Bjorn wandered alone through the unfamiliar city. Although he had a destination in mind, he simply wanted to follow wherever his feet carried him. The city felt remarkably peaceful. The first time Bjorn had seen it was in the middle of the night, but now the streets were crowded under the daylight. There were no monsters here, and no one was trying to kill him. The city even had laws and rules that maintained order. He could probably collapse beside the road and sleep without being harmed. Someone might even offer him help before that happened. Of course, Bjorn knew this city was still incredibly primitive compared to 21st century Earth. Even so, it was peaceful. Perhaps living in this city wouldn't be such a bad choice. Lost in his thoughts, Bjorn unknowingly drifted off to sleep. When he opened his eyes again, it was already 9 at night. Since they had left the labyrinth around noon, Bjorn assumed he had slept for roughly 4 or 5 hours. He slowly rose and headed toward the Black Whale Tavern, where he had agreed to meet Owen. After asking around, Bjorn finally found the tavern. However, it looked completely different from the version he remembered in the game. The moment he opened the door and stepped inside, he was greeted by a loud and chaotic scene. Just then, Bjorn heard an excited voice calling out to him. Owen had already arrived, but another female elf he had seen earlier that day was sitting quietly beside her. Owen introduced the woman as her biological older sister. From the moment she saw Bjorn, Owen's sister stared at him as though he were a criminal, making him extremely uncomfortable. Bjorn asked why she had come to the tavern. Owen's sister angrily pointed at him and demanded, "Why did you call Owen to a place like this in the middle of the night? What exactly are you planning?" Bjorn couldn't understand the question at all, but judging by her expression, she was completely serious. After recovering from his confusion, Bjorn asked Owen how many hours had passed since they left the labyrinth. To his shock, Owen answered that 30 hours had passed. Bjorn froze. He hadn't slept for 4 hours, but an entire 30 hours. No wonder every part of his body ached. He had actually slept through an entire day. Bjorn offered no excuses and sincerely apologized to Owen. His apology left both sisters visibly stunned, as though they had never seen a barbarian apologize before. Trucia once again asked Bjorn why he had arranged to meet Owen. Bjorn could have given her countless reasons, but he had no intention of telling her. Instead, he answered firmly, "I don't want to tell you. If you're really that curious, ask Owen yourself later." What Bjorn truly meant was that Trucia should stop getting in the way and leave. Fortunately, she understood him perfectly, because the anger on her face said everything. Trucia suddenly placed a storage bag on the table. There are 350,000 gold inside. Consider it payment for the essence Owen absorbed. She apparently wanted Bjorn to take the money and disappear. It felt like a classic scene straight out of a TV drama. After calming himself, Bjorn left the decision to Owen. He had given her the essence because he wanted her help obtaining the essence he needed in the future. If Owen agreed, Bjorn wanted to continue adventuring with her and change their loot distribution to an even 50-50 split. Simply put, he wanted Owen to become his permanent two-person partner. The moment Owen heard that, her eyes sparkled with excitement. But the light in her eyes quickly faded as Owen looked at Bjorn apologetically. Trusha explained the situation for her. The elves had a tradition requiring their first expedition after adulthood to be completed alone. After that, however, Owen was required to enter the labyrinth with her older sister. The answer caught Bjorn completely off guard, but he quickly accepted it. Owen was highly compatible with him, but there was no reason to insist that she had to be his partner. Since they couldn't continue as a party, Bjorn decided to settle their accounts and confirmed the essence's market price with Trusha. The 350,000 gold Trusha had offered was only half the essence's market value. Under their original 90-10 agreement, they still owed Bjorn another 280,000 gold. Before Bjorn could finish speaking, the cunning elf remarked, "I nearly forgot about that." She then produced another storage bag containing exactly 280,000 gold. Bjorn cursed internally. He had nearly been taken for a complete fool, and now he finally understood why barbarians hated elves so much. With a dark expression, Bjorn claimed that he needed to speak with Owen privately and told Trusha to leave once her business was finished. Owen also looked at her sister with pleading eyes. Her normally obedient younger sister had never behaved this way before, leaving Trusha visibly surprised. Trusha let out a helpless sigh before suddenly pointing at Bjorn. She demanded that Bjorn swear he would never sleep with Owen. Bjorn wondered whether he had heard her correctly. If sleeping together was the only thing forbidden, did that mean every other form of physical contact was allowed? This elf clearly thought she was smarter than she really was. Bjorn immediately swore on his honor as a warrior. After all, as someone transported into this world, he had never cared about a warrior's honor. After hearing his oath, Trusha sincerely thanked Bjorn for saving Owen's life. She then turned around and confidently walked out of the tavern. The moment the bell above the tavern door rang, Owen collapsed face first onto the table. She had never defied her older sister like this in her entire life. However, judging by the smile Trusha had shown before leaving, she probably wasn't truly angry. After Bjorn comforted her, Owen finally raised her head and pulled more than 60,000 gold from her pocket. The money had belonged to the archer and the red-haired man who attacked them. Their remaining equipment was too bulky to carry, so Owen had stored it in her dormitory and planned to bring it next time. After spending so much time with Bjorn, Owen clearly understood exactly what he wanted. Although Bjorn had decisively given up on keeping her as his partner, he still felt reluctant to let her go. Owen then cautiously asked how she could repay him. She had never forgotten her promise to repay him for saving her life. Bjorn finally realized why Trusha had forced him to swear that oath. She must have feared he would demand something inappropriate from Owen. Bjorn couldn't think of anything else he wanted for now. Besides, after sleeping through an entire day, his stomach wouldn't stop growling. When Bjorn asked Owen what she wanted to eat, she hesitated before admitting that she wanted a drink. Owen had deliberately avoided alcohol at the previous day's celebration because she wanted to share her first return drink with Bjorn. The return drink was an established tradition in the game world. For members of other races who had spent their entire childhood inside sacred lands, the celebratory drink after safely returning from their first labyrinth expedition held tremendous meaning. Owen added that they had survived countless hardships together inside the labyrinth, so she had to share her first return drink with Bjorn. What Owen didn't know was that this would also be Bjorn's first return drink. Bjorn had told her inside the labyrinth that he was also 20 years old, but Owen had assumed he was joking. No wonder she had always treated him like an old man. In reality, Bjorn had only just become a true warrior, just like Owen, and this had also been his first time entering the labyrinth. Before long, an entire table filled with delicious food was served. Bjorn and Owen ate and drank while talking about all kinds of subjects. Inside the labyrinth, they had only exchanged necessary information most of the time. This was their first genuine personal conversation. Owen clearly had a low alcohol tolerance. After only one drink, she began staring at Bjorn with dreamy, captivating eyes. She drunkenly muttered, "You look really handsome today, mister. You're also really good at drinking." With that seductive expression, Owen looked like a truly bewitching elf. Bjorn suddenly thought of a way she could repay him. However, his request couldn't be carried out inside the tavern, or the city guards would quickly arrest them. The moment Owen heard that, her face turned bright red. She gave him an alluring look and asked, "Then how about we go to your room together, mister?" Once they reached the room, Bjorn began carefully examining Owen's body. Of course, he hadn't broken the oath he made to Owen's sister. Although an oath from this world meant nothing to Bjorn, he and Owen had been thinking about completely different things from the beginning. Bjorn instructed her, "Owen, spread your legs a little farther." He was forcing her through a stretching routine, making her cry out repeatedly in pain. The instant Bjorn released her arm, Owen curled up in the corner as though she had been given a second chance at life, terrified that he might stretch her again. After examining her carefully, Bjorn discovered that absorbing the goblin essence had increased Owen's flexibility by 4 points. However, judging by her painful expression, the stat increase hadn't produced an obvious physical change. After learning Bjorn's true intention, Owen muttered disappointedly, "So you brought me to an inn, just to examine my abilities." Judging by her dejected expression, she had clearly expected something else. Using abilities inside the city would cause the patrol guards to arrest them, so Bjorn had needed a private room to conduct the examination. Dungeon and Stone was an extremely unforgiving game, and its character stat screen made that perfectly clear. Most games divided character stats into only 3 categories: physical, mental, and special. But in this game, clicking the plus sign revealed thousands of individual substats. For example, even if a character's total physical stat remained fixed, increasing the muscles in their lower body would improve their carrying capacity. Their physical attack power would increase as well. In other words, depending on how those substats were distributed, characters with the same total stats could possess completely different capabilities. The Goblin Archer Essence Owen had absorbed listed Persistence +7 on its stat screen. Bjorn only knew that Persistence was a mental stat. Its actual effects remained a mystery. As for Owen, absorbing the Persistence stat had caused one strange change. Since leaving the labyrinth, the only noticeable difference was that she had suddenly developed a fondness for cookies. While Bjorn remained absorbed in analyzing these details, Owen gently tugged on the edge of his clothes. Her eyes were so heavy that she could barely keep them open. Bjorn still had many details he wanted to examine, but given her condition, they had to stop for the night. Bjorn blew out the candle and lay down on the bed. Owen showed no hesitation and fell asleep while curled up against Bjorn's chest. Bjorn remembered Trusha warning them not to sleep together. But this innocent kind of sleeping was clearly not what she had meant. While entertaining those thoughts, Bjorn gradually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Bjorn and Owen sat side by side on the bed. They excitedly examined the equipment, arranged neatly across the floor. Every item was loot from their journey through the labyrinths. They kept only the items they genuinely needed. The remaining equipment took them the entire morning to handle. They visited every major merchant house and sold each item for an excellent price. Once the final piece of equipment was sold, they calculated their total earnings. They now possessed the enormous sum of 1,450,000 gold. After giving Owen her 50,000 gold share, Bjorn's personal earnings totaled 1,400,000 gold. For adventurers returning from their first labyrinth expedition, that was an unbelievable amount of money. Once they finished dividing the profits, Bjorn decided to escort Owen to the central plaza before they separated. The pair continued walking until they reached the central plaza near the crossroads. Unlike when they had passed through earlier, the plaza was now overflowing with a restless crowd. They approached in confusion and discovered that soldiers were carrying out public executions. But the condemned people weren't murderers, robbers, or arsonists. Their only crime was failing to pay their taxes. In other words, they were being executed simply because they had no money. At the soldier's command, the condemned man's head dropped from the execution platform and landed inside the wooden tub below. But the nearby spectators suddenly rushed toward the tub with loaves of bread they had brought with them. Even more horrifyingly, they soaked the bread in the blood before greedily devouring it. The sudden bloodshed frightened Owen so badly that she began hiccuping. To her, this scene was even more disturbing than the beheading itself. The crowd behaved this way because of a simple superstition. Consuming the blood of an executed criminal would greatly improve their financial luck. Since Bjorn and Owen both belonged to non-human races, each of them owed 700,000 gold in annual taxes. The amount differed slightly from the game, but there was nothing they could do about it. The taxes would also increase every year, making the first year the most important time to invest in themselves and grow stronger. Certain fees were waived during the first year, and the lower taxes made it the best period for rapid growth. If Bjorn became too comfortable and never found a way back to reality, the bread those people soaked in blood might one day be covered in his blood instead. To avoid that fate, he had to earn money relentlessly and become strong enough to operate freely on the labyrinth's 6th floor. If Bjorn wanted to survive in this world without being executed, he needed to learn everything he could about it. After separating from Owen, he headed straight to the library. The building smelled of paper and ink, and its silence was so oppressive that even coughing felt forbidden. Yet inside such a quiet place, Bjorn encountered another barbarian. She was Einar, second daughter of Penelin. Only the barbarian's finest female warrior could sleep so soundly in an environment like this. Bjorn walked up behind Einar and lightly poked her back. Einar jolted awake and completely ignored the library's silence as she loudly shouted Bjorn's name. Encountering a fellow barbarian inside the library clearly made her even more excited. After noticing everyone staring, Einar finally lowered her voice. Surprisingly, she'd come to the library because of a single piece of advice Bjorn had given her. Before entering the labyrinth, when Einar got the barbarians lost, Bjorn had advised her to think carefully before taking action. Those words made Einar realize that she needed knowledge before she could think properly. It was a surprisingly impressive conclusion. If she hadn't been snoring over an open book, her determination might have been genuinely admirable. Even so, she had already done far better than the other barbarians. Judging by her explanation, the first labyrinth expedition had also dealt a serious blow to her confidence. The other barbarians only knew how to brag about how easily they had killed monsters. Einar had chosen to study instead. Unfortunately, she discovered that she couldn't recognize many of the words in the books, and eventually fell asleep. After explaining herself, Einar immediately stood and prepared to return to the sacred land so the elders could teach her how to read. The more Bjorn learned about barbarians, the more tragic their race seemed. Einar feared that if she didn't act the moment an idea came to her, she would quickly forget her decision. As Einar headed toward the exit, she suddenly remembered something. She turned and told Bjorn that since she had survived her first labyrinth expedition, she would repay him for the advice he had given her. She added that if Bjorn ever needed help, he could find her at the Angry Bull Inn. Bjorn only hoped she would remember that promise for another day or two, because he expected to need her help very soon. After Einar left, Bjorn wandered through the library for a while. The building was absolutely enormous. Unlike in the 21st century, there were no computers that could immediately show him where each book was located. Bjorn had no idea how to find the books he needed. While struggling with the problem, he noticed a librarian dozing at her desk. The female librarian slowly opened her eyes when Bjorn deliberately cleared his throat. Before Bjorn could explain what kind of book he wanted, the librarian, who had looked half asleep only moments earlier, suddenly cast a spell. At the same time, a faint light entered Bjorn's body. Just as he prepared to dodge cautiously, the librarian spoke. In a lazy voice, she explained that Bjorn could simply wander around from now on. Once he reached the correct section, the books he wanted would automatically appear. After explaining everything, the librarian lowered her head and began dozing again. Bjorn followed her instructions and wandered through the library. Before long, he understood what she meant by the books appearing automatically. Whenever Bjorn thought of a keyword, his eyes would automatically locate the relevant books. No wonder such an enormous library needed only one librarian. This magic made finding books incredibly convenient. Bjorn then selected the title that interested him most. The first book was titled The Ruined World. It was nearly 1,000 pages long and described the earliest history of this world. According to the book, the world had suffered under a witch's curse for thousands of years. To survive, humanity had been forced to hide inside the last remaining castle. To obtain additional resources, the royal family forcibly opened a passage to another realm. That passage eventually became the labyrinth. The second book was titled Basic Understanding and Notes on Alchemy. It explained how magic stones taken from monsters were processed and transformed into resources such as bread, water, and steel. Although Bjorn couldn't understand the principles involved, he forced himself to memorize the information. The third book was extremely important to Bjorn's current situation. It was titled Evil Spirits of the Abyss. In this world, an evil spirit was defined as a wicked being from another plane but stole someone else's body. The book didn't explain why evil spirits appeared, but it described the enormous effort the royal family and the temple had made to eradicate them. After finishing the book, Bjorn reached one conclusion. As long as he never mentioned knowledge considered taboo in this world, no one would suspect him of being an evil spirit. The next book was titled On the Death of the King. It described the death of Orbigion III, who was remembered as the first king. The first king had died 150 years earlier, while the game's story began on the day after his death. In other words, Bjorn was living 150 years after the game's original timeline. No wonder his knowledge of the game was so often inaccurate. The final book was titled Observation Records of Dimensional Instability. It described the same phenomenon mentioned by the blonde man who had rescued Bjorn. The book theorized that entering the labyrinth at the exact moment its entrance closed could trigger dimensional instability. Bjorn finally understood that he had been sent to the dark zone because he entered at the moment the labyrinth closed. After reading that section, Bjorn finally lifted his head from the book. The sky outside had already turned dark. It was now the 3rd day since he left the labyrinth, and every month in this world lasted exactly 30 days. That meant the labyrinth would open again in 27 days. So Bjorn needed to find a new partner to replace Owen as quickly as possible. After a long day, Bjorn returned to his room and soon fell asleep. But a sudden knock at the door interrupted his sleep. It was already the following morning, and Owen was excitedly pounding on his door. The instant Bjorn opened it, an intense blue light engulfed his entire body. Owen had absorbed a new essence, and it possessed the wind attribute, which complemented her fire attribute. The problem was that she still had no idea how to control it. In a single moment, she turned Bjorn's room into a complete disaster. Even more surprisingly, Owen made the room spotless again in only 10 minutes. Her claim inside the labyrinth that she excelled at cooking, cleaning, and doing laundry had actually been true. Once they sat down again, Bjorn congratulated Owen on obtaining her new essence. Then, with his usual bluntness, he asked, "You didn't need to come all this way just for something like this, did you?" To prepare for the next labyrinth expedition, Owen should have been spending her time on something more meaningful. Before Bjorn could finish speaking, Owen's expression became deeply dejected. She admitted that everything he said was correct, but she couldn't control herself and had wanted to share her happiness with him first. Perhaps it was because Bjorn was her first partner. Or maybe the girl truly had some strange fantasy about him. To maintain their relationship for the future, Bjorn immediately adopted the polished expression of an expert salesman. He explained that he would continue staying at this inn, so Owen could visit him anytime she had questions. Although, they couldn't work together during the next labyrinth expedition. Maintaining a good relationship with Owen was still worthwhile. Bjorn ended in a firm voice, "Because we're comrades who have survived life and death situations together." A bright smile immediately returned to Owen's face. After separating from Owen, Bjorn began searching for the fastest way to improve his personal strength. He headed to the Angry Bull Inn that Einar had mentioned earlier. To Bjorn's surprise, the place was filled with barbarians. A room cost only 300 gold per day, but 10 warriors had to share its 5 beds. To save money, they even created a schedule and took turns sleeping in those beds. After learning how the inn operated, Bjorn found the person he had come to see, Einar, second daughter of Penelin. When Einar asked why he had come, Bjorn answered with the bluntness of a true barbarian warrior. "I want to fight you." Bjorn desperately needed combat training. He had earned better results inside the labyrinth than any other barbarian, but when it came to pure fighting technique, he was no match for these warriors. Einar readily accepted his challenge, and the two headed to the training ground. The other barbarians, who had been sparring nearby, immediately stopped and gathered excitedly to watch. Although Bjorn had come to learn, he still didn't want to lose too miserably. But the barbarians who had recently praised Bjorn as the greatest warrior immediately switched sides. They excitedly shouted, "Einar is the greatest warrior of all time." Bjorn went from taking blows to losing his shield in an unbelievably short time. Einar needed fewer than 3 minutes to defeat him completely. Her fighting technique was genuinely impressive. Bjorn refused to give up and continued challenging her, only to be knocked down several more times. Einar wasn't only powerful, but also highly intelligent. She was completely different from an ordinary barbarian. Their shared racial bonds also meant Bjorn didn't have to worry about her betraying him easily. So Bjorn made the best choice available to him. He asked seriously, "Einar, will you become my partner? The loot will be divided 80-20. Bjorn would cover every expense required to maintain their party." Before he could finish, Einar suddenly interrupted him. Bjorn assumed she was dissatisfied with the ratio, and hurriedly explained that he would cover many additional expenses. Instead, Einar firmly grasped Bjorn's right hand and answered without hesitation, "I don't understand anything about 80-20, but I trust Bjorn, son of Yandel." Bjorn finally breathed a sigh of relief. He had found a knight companion he could genuinely trust. The following day, they arrived at the barbarians' sacred land, where the chieftain was already waiting for them. Bjorn still vividly remembered how decisively the chieftain had killed the person possessed by an evil spirit. For that reason, Bjorn disliked coming here, but to obtain a soul imprint, specifically the undying art, He had no choice but to face the chieftain. This was an imprint ability Bjorn had to acquire before entering the labyrinth again. Each race in this world possessed its own unique racial abilities. Elves could obtain soul essences through contracts. Dwarves could use blessings of fortune to increase their forging success rate. Druids could form contracts with soul beasts to strengthen their combat abilities. Barbarian warriors could receive soul imprints, and the undying art Bjorn had requested was one type of barbarian soul imprint. The moment Bjorn finished speaking, the chieftain's warm smile vanished, and he stared at Bjorn with murderous eyes. What Bjorn had mentioned wasn't something an ordinary young warrior should know. The chieftain's gaze now looked exactly the same as when he killed the evil spirit during the coming-of-age ceremony. The chieftain was clearly suffering from terminal paranoia. Fortunately, Bjorn had prepared a way to deal with someone like him. Bjorn had researched soul imprints at the library, so he quickly explained that he'd read about their importance during the war over the elves' sacred relic. Before Bjorn could finish, the chieftain interrupted him with booming laughter. "You actually visited the library? How interesting. Including Einar, your generation has produced 2 remarkable warriors." His praise revealed how pleased he was to see young barbarians eager to learn. Then his expression became serious again. If a warrior needs a soul imprint, the barbarians have no reason to refuse. However, there was one major problem. A soul imprint cost 800,000 gold. The process required many expensive medicinal ingredients. Higher-level imprints demanded even more gold, and without the proper materials, they couldn't be performed at all. Bjorn had already anticipated this problem and prepared the money. Under everyone's astonished gaze, he produced a heavy bag of gold. To eliminate their remaining suspicions, Bjorn altered the story of his adventures with Owen and told them an entirely different version. He claimed that after entering the labyrinth's first floor, he'd been lucky enough to encounter a wounded elf. He then worked her like a slave throughout the labyrinth and obtained a completely useless essence along the way. As compensation, he extorted a large amount of gold from the elf's older sister. The chieftain burst out laughing. "You're the first warrior to bleed those despicable elves dry. Well done, Bjorn, son of Yendel." Unexpectedly, everyone loved the story. The chieftain looked delighted, and even the other tribesmen rushed over with excited smiles. Still laughing, the chieftain returned 200,000 gold and called it a gift for a great young warrior. Bjorn had earned 200,000 gold simply by telling a story. The chieftain truly was a wonderful man. Bjorn sincerely roared, "I'll work even harder and show those elves who's boss." Was this what people meant when they said someone became more charming over time? Bjorn could feel himself gradually falling in love with the barbarian race. A soul imprint was an enhancement technique that injected mana from magical materials into the body, granting the recipient a special power. To ensure that adult barbarians could still see their soul circuits, these special tattoos were applied during infancy, while their souls were still pure. That was why every barbarian's body was covered in tattoos. The undying art was also essential for anyone who wanted to become a powerful defensive warrior. Bjorn had expected the imprinting process to be easy, but once it began, the overwhelming pain made him scream at the top of his lungs. The thought of enduring this pain regularly made Bjorn hate the entire process. After successfully receiving the soul imprint, Bjorn immediately headed to a weapons dealer. Through his repeated sparring sessions with Einar, he'd realized that hammer-type weapons didn't suit him. Now that he possessed the undying art, a reinforced shield and a more agile weapon suited him far better. In the end, he spent 220,000 gold on a one-handed weapon. Since no existing helmet fit him, he spent another 170,000 gold on a custom order, combined with armor worth 360,000 gold. This left him with only around 50,000 gold. Meanwhile, Bjorn's daily schedule became completely fixed. He woke around 7 every morning and ate breakfast with Owen. He then visited the library and continued reading until 4 in the afternoon. At around 5, he headed to the Angry Bull Inn for combat training. Starting on the 7th day of training, Bjorn also began sparring with the other barbarian warriors. It wasn't the systematic training method he'd hoped for, but fighting through instinct and intuition still helped him tremendously. Through constant practice, Bjorn occasionally managed to defeat Einar. She was highly skilled, but her attack patterns were too predictable. Bjorn offered her advice, but deeply ingrained fighting habits couldn't be changed in a short time. After training, Bjorn returned to the inn and took a bath. By the time he finished, it was usually around 9 at night, and Owen would arrive right on time to share a late-night meal. Bjorn wanted to tell Owen that she didn't need to spend hours traveling back and forth for a single meal, but whenever he saw her radiant smile, he couldn't bring himself to say it. By the time they finished eating, it was usually around 11 at night. Bjorn's repetitive daily routine quickly came to an end, and only 2 hours remained before the labyrinth opened again. Bjorn and Einar arrived early at their meeting place, the Adventurers Guild. If they wanted to be transported to the same area after entering the labyrinth, they first had to register as an official party. Following the administrator's instructions, they placed their hands on the crystal ball together, causing it to emit a faint blue light. The administrator then informed them that the registration fee for 2 rank 9 adventurers was 15,000 gold. If Bjorn hadn't saved money on his living expenses, he might not have been able to afford it. Although the cost hurt, Bjorn obediently paid. Starting locations inside the labyrinth were normally random, but this magic ensured that registered party members would begin in the same place. After leaving the Adventurers Guild, they visited a nearby upscale restaurant. During their conversation, Bjorn learned that Einar had been eating nothing but hard rolls that cost only 30 gold each to save money. It was a truly heartbreaking story. To repay Einar for helping him train, Bjorn decided to treat her to a proper meal. He ordered the most expensive grilled meat platter in the restaurant. Einar immediately swore her loyalty, declaring that even if Bjorn jumped into a pit of fire, she would follow him as long as he never abandoned her. The two quickly devoured their deeply satisfying meal. They then arrived at the labyrinth entrance with 10 minutes remaining before it opened. The surrounding streets were filled with unusual passers-by, all fully armed just like Bjorn. However, one group stood out even among the crowd. They were barbarians wearing almost nothing and carrying only their weapons. Judging by their appearance, they had just completed their coming-of-age ceremony. Einar remarked that they reminded her of herself 1 month earlier, but from Bjorn's perspective, she hadn't changed much at all. Just then, a booming voice announced that entry was permitted. The moment the announcement ended, the crowded plaza emptied almost instantly. Unable to hide her excitement, Einar asked whether they should enter. Bjorn told her to wait because he wanted to conduct an experiment. According to a book he'd read, entering the labyrinth during dimensional instability could produce a miracle. Before Bjorn could finish explaining, Einar hurriedly admitted that she didn't understand anything so complicated and would simply follow his instructions. But as Bjorn insisted on waiting, Einar's expression gradually became uneasy. Only about 1 minute remained before the entrance closed, and it had already shrunk to roughly the same size as when Bjorn first entered. Soon, a warning rang across the plaza that the labyrinth entrance was about to close. The moment Bjorn heard the warning, he decisively led Einar into the labyrinth. When they opened their eyes after passing through the entrance, they found themselves surrounded by endless darkness. As Einar cried out in panic, Bjorn calmly lit the torch he prepared in advance. Just as Bjorn predicted, entering while the entrance magic was unstable transported them directly near the passage to the second floor. They had completely skipped the monster battles and blind wandering that every other adventurer had to endure. Bjorn then activated the magic circle leading to the second floor. A system notification immediately rang out. You are the first person to open the portal. You have gained 2 experience points, and your soul level has increased by 1. Einar still couldn't believe what had happened, because the chieftain had told every newcomer that reaching the second floor required at least 3 days. Bjorn ignored her amazement because the scenery before him was genuinely terrifying. The blackened earth, suffocating air, and wet squelching sound beneath every step created a deeply unsettling atmosphere. Faint sobbing could even be heard nearby. If Bjorn remembered correctly, this area was the tomb of the dead. Perhaps because he'd entered the second floor, Bjorn suddenly felt an incredibly dense energy flowing through his veins. After asking Einar about it, he learned that this sensation came from his increased soul level. Dungeon and Stone also had a leveling system, and each level provided a different amount of soul power. For example, Bjorn's mana would increase as his level rose, along with the number of essences he could absorb. Although Einar congratulated Bjorn, she couldn't understand how he'd leveled up without killing a single monster. Bjorn suspected that he'd gained the level by completing an achievement. For example, the first person to open the entrance to the next floor would receive experience points. It was a relatively easy way to level up. However, Bjorn needed to keep this secret. He immediately told Einar to keep their entry method confidential. If anyone asked, she had to claim that they'd needed 2 days to reach the second floor. Experienced adventurers could reach the second floor quickly, but seeing 2 beginners arrive ahead of them would definitely raise suspicion. The pair needed to keep a low profile. In this world, Bjorn feared those damned adventurers far more than he feared monsters. Before long, Bjorn found himself doing something extremely embarrassing. Other adventurers had used the same method, but actually doing it himself still felt deeply uncomfortable. Bjorn called this state Barbarian Candle Mode. Torches in this world were magical tools that continued burning for 3 full days once lit. The monsters inside the Tomb of the Dead were stronger than those in the Goblin Forest. However, this area contained no traps. That made it far more suitable for barbarians who preferred charging straight through everything. Einar soon detected 3 ghouls. There were only 3 because it was still the first day. Starting on the 3rd day, the number of monsters would double. Einar excitedly shouted, "It's been far too long since I stretched my muscles." The moment she finished speaking, she eagerly charged forward to face the 3 monsters alone. She truly deserved her reputation as the strongest female barbarian warrior. In a single exchange, she completely overwhelmed all 3 ghouls. But the fearless Einar screamed and wrapped herself around Bjorn's neck only a moment later. Apparently, even someone with her powerful physique could be terrified of ghostly monsters. The nearby creature was a banshee. Banshees normally didn't attack people without provocation, so the pair could safely ignore it. Bjorn could understand why Einar feared creatures like this. But he wished she wouldn't cling to him every time she heard a strange noise. Didn't she realize how heavy she was? Whenever Einar wrapped herself around him, Bjorn felt as though half his life was being crushed out of him. When Einar realized the latest noise had come from ordinary skeleton soldiers, her face turned red with embarrassment. To hide her humiliation, she immediately raised her sword and charged into the group of skeletons. Afterward, the pair continued north for nearly 8 hours. As they traveled deeper, they encountered new monsters, including giant ghouls twice the size of ordinary ones. They also encountered mutated skeleton warriors and skeleton archers. However, none of these monsters posed much danger because it was still only the labyrinth's first day. Only a few monsters spawned at a time. And Bjorn was far stronger than during his first expedition. Most importantly, his weapon's size and weight suited him perfectly. This allowed Bjorn to smash skeleton skulls efficiently, while his full-body armor let him fight far more aggressively. Finally, his custom-made helmet protected his head during critical moments. It could easily stop the arrows fired by skeleton archers. Bjorn was highly skilled at eliminating enemies, but his companion was even more ferocious. At first, Bjorn couldn't understand why barbarians loved shouting so much during battle. But after fighting beside Einar, he finally understood the reason. Bjorn had become completely addicted to this pure style of combat. Fighting beside Einar felt even more exhilarating than working with Owen. The battles had brought plenty of rewards, but Bjorn had also suffered numerous wounds. Miraculously, those injuries began healing on their own. The sight immediately filled Einar with envy. This was the undying art Bjorn had obtained for 600,000 gold. Its level 1 effect was natural regeneration, allowing minor wounds like these to heal in roughly 1 minute. Before they realized it, the surrounding terrain began to change. The ground was no longer damp and gradually became solid, while the banshees' cries grew much clearer. This meant they had entered a high-level monster zone and would soon encounter rank 8 monsters. But before Bjorn could finish warning Einar, heavy, sluggish footsteps echoed from the distance. A massive creature soon appeared before them. It was an undead monster specifically designed to raise the difficulty barrier on the 2nd floor. The creature had been specially strengthened for this floor. Bjorn and Einar had prepared a strategy beforehand, but seeing the monster in person, it looked even more terrifying than expected. Bjorn warned Einar again, "Aim only for the head. Attacking anywhere else is pointless." It had a humanoid body over 10 feet tall, but one arm ended in a blade, while the other formed a shield. The so-called Protean sword and shield. Einar gripped her great blade with both hands and charged first. Bjorn roared and followed closely behind, swinging his weapon into the creature's side. But the heavy impact traveling through his weapon felt nothing like striking ordinary flesh. It felt as though he'd smashed his weapon against solid rock. The monster was incredibly tough, but Bjorn's attack successfully drew its attention. That gave Einar the perfect opportunity to strike its head from the front. Bjorn thought the battle would end right there, but the monster deflected Einar's full-powered slash. Bjorn hadn't expected its defense to be this overwhelming. In the game, this creature was already infamous among players for its incredible defense. But Bjorn had never imagined it would be this difficult to fight in person. The area Einar had struck returned to normal within seconds, clearly because of the monster's passive skill. While Bjorn considered their next move, the monster suddenly released a deafening roar. The pressure radiating from its body became even more powerful than before. Then, to their disbelief, the creature activated its active skill and summoned ghouls. As the ground trembled, a horde of undead ghouls charged straight toward them. Bjorn didn't hesitate. he immediately ordered Einar to eliminate the ghouls first. Meanwhile, Bjorn remained behind to restrain the massive monster alone. The creature possessed a regeneration-based passive skill, but Bjorn also had the Undying Art. Bjorn had no intention of dodging. Instead, he greeted the monster with the most sincere form of barbarian etiquette, trading blows face to face. Heavy impacts immediately echoed throughout the area. While Bjorn lost himself in the brutal duel, Einar rejoined the battle. She had already eliminated every ghoul, and her return greatly reduced the pressure on Bjorn. The moment the monster became distracted, Bjorn slammed his hammer into the side of its head. Blood immediately began pouring from the creature's ear, but before Bjorn could celebrate, the injury began healing again. Any ordinary monster would have died instantly from an attack like that. But this creature's regenerative ability was far too powerful. Were they really going to have to abandon this area and return to a lower-level monster zone? Just as Bjorn considered retreating, the monster suddenly lost its balance and began swaying violently. Einar had spotted an opening. She grabbed one of the 3-meter-tall creature's legs and lifted it off the ground. It was a technique Bjorn had often seen in mixed martial arts. With her muscles bulging and veins protruding, Einar looked more like a monster than their actual enemy. Bjorn immediately joined the attack. He swung his weapon with all his strength and struck the ankle still supporting the creature's weight. With a heavy crash, the massive monster finally slammed into the ground. The pair then witnessed a delightful sight. Once the creature fell, it could only twist and squirm like an insect. It couldn't stand up again without assistance, which was an extremely satisfying discovery. Bjorn loved this style of fighting. Einar loved it just as much. This was the true fighting style of the barbarians. A system notification immediately rang out. Undead monster eliminated. You have gained 2 experience points. As the corpse dissolved into light, Bjorn and Einar exchanged brilliant smiles. They possessed no powerful magic. Even so, they had defeated a rank 8 monster through brute strength alone. As Einar shouted excitedly, they discovered a fist-sized magic stone where the monster had disappeared. In this world, a rank 9 magic stone could only buy a bread roll worth roughly 20 gold. A rank 8 magic stone was worth 5 times as much. In other words, the giant monster they'd risked their lives to kill was worth only 5 bread rolls. Even after including the summoned ghouls, the entire battle had earned them just 300 gold. After learning the exact value, Einar solemnly asked how much the pastry they'd eaten at the inn had cost. Bjorn remembered that the cream-filled pastry had been worth exactly 300 gold. Einar immediately grinned with excitement. So every time we kill one giant monster, we can eat another cream-filled pastry. The cream-filled pastry had apparently become Einar's new unit of currency. Under their 80-20 agreement, however, her share from each monster would only buy a small bite. Bjorn decided not to tell her, and Einar enthusiastically shouted that they should keep hunting. Bjorn's disappointment over the low earnings lasted only a moment. Seeing Einar regain her enthusiasm made him smile as well. In that respect, partnering with another barbarian was an excellent choice. Owen had also been a great companion, but she was far more passive. At that exact moment, Owen, who was exploring with her older sister, suddenly felt an inexplicable sense of regret. Afterward, Bjorn and Einar continued hunting the giant undead nearby. Whenever they found one, they charged forward while roaring their ancestors' names. Each of them grabbed one of the monster's legs, lifted it into the air, and slammed it onto the ground. They then pounded its head like rice cake until the creature dissolved into light. Using this method, they killed 70 giant monsters in a single day. Before they realized it, the labyrinth's second day had arrived. Starting on the second day, the giant monsters began appearing in pairs. But after fighting more than 70 of them on the first day, Bjorn and Einar had already learned numerous ways to handle them. The battles weren't as difficult as expected. They knocked down one monster first, then used the same method on the other. Of course, if they failed to kill the monsters quickly, the summoned ghouls would completely surround them. Fortunately, the monsters wouldn't continue chasing them beyond their territory, so Bjorn and Einar only needed to run for their lives. However, pairs became increasingly rare after the second afternoon. Whenever they encountered 3 or more monsters together, they had no choice but to abandon the hunt. Bjorn and Einar finished their second day of hunting through a constant cycle of killing monsters and running for their lives. But as they prepared to return to their previous campsite, they encountered another party of adventurers for the first time. The group consisted of 3 people who, just like Bjorn and Einar, were wandering through the darkness with a single torch. Both parties visibly froze when they noticed each other, but Einar immediately warned them in a murderous voice. "If you don't need anything, then get lost." The other party didn't attempt to argue with her. The three adventurers quickly turned around and disappeared into the darkness. Einar then told Bjorn that they needed to find a new campsite because those adventurers now knew their location, and humans couldn't be trusted. Bjorn remembered that Einar had shown the same intense hatred toward humans when he encountered her at the library. Something terrible must have happened during her first labyrinth expedition. The pair began searching for a new campsite, but they couldn't find another location as suitable as the previous one. Just then, painful groans echoed from somewhere ahead. The groans were mixed with desperate pleas for mercy. Normal humans wouldn't beg monsters to spare their lives, so the situation was obvious. Humans were killing other humans. Damn it. How had they stumbled into such a terrible situation? Bjorn and Einar immediately prepared to leave, but as an icy voice rang out, something resembling a flare shot into the air and instantly illuminated the surrounding area. Thanks to that light, Bjorn could clearly see what had happened. 4 recently killed bodies were lying on the ground. There were no monsters nearby, only a campfire and clear traces of poison. The woman before them was a raider who specialized in murder and robbery. Raiders hunted fellow adventurers and earned enormous profits by stealing their equipment. Of course, attacking and robbing other adventurers was illegal in this world, and anyone caught doing it could receive the death penalty. But if no witnesses survived to report the crime, the authorities outside the labyrinth would never know what happened. Bjorn had killed 6 adventurers during his first labyrinth expedition, yet no one had investigated him. The worst part was that the raider wasn't wearing a mask. Bjorn and Einar had seen her face clearly. The woman was roughly 5 feet 7 inches tall, with a slim and slender build. She had shoulder-length dark red hair and a distinctive tattoo beneath her left eye. If Bjorn and Einar escaped the labyrinth alive, they'd be able to identify and report her. Bjorn had never encountered such a professional raider. Until now, he'd never even heard of someone this dangerous operating on the 2nd floor. That meant no one who'd encountered this woman had ever survived to tell the story. 4 bodies lay on the ground, and their high-quality equipment marked them as experienced adventurers. One of them was even a mage. They were probably adventurers who normally operated around the 5th floor. Yet the woman had killed all 4 without suffering a single injury. Her strength clearly surpassed the level expected on the 5th floor. While Bjorn analyzed the situation, the woman crouched down and expertly stripped the equipment from the corpses. She placed each item inside her bag, and even the enormous greatsword fit without difficulty. That meant her backpack was an extremely expensive dimensional storage bag. Bjorn felt no envy or jealousy, only endless fear. The storage bag alone made the enormous difference between their strength painfully obvious. While collecting the loot, the woman quietly asked, "Barbarians, were you with these people?" Bjorn didn't answer, but Einar quietly asked whether they should challenge her while reaching for the great sword on her back. Einar was an admirable warrior who would face any enemy regardless of their strength, but no matter how Bjorn analyzed the situation, they had absolutely no chance of winning. Their only way to survive was to run. The moment the flare went out, Bjorn ordered Einar to flee with every ounce of strength she had. Pride meant nothing when their lives were at stake. They sprinted desperately through the darkness, while Bjorn occasionally checked his compass. Their only hope was to reach the portal back to the 1st floor. Fortunately, their equipment still made them look like beginners. Otherwise, the raider might have immediately considered them valuable prey. Just as Bjorn began feeling relieved, another 4-person party appeared ahead. Humans were difficult to trust, but from another perspective, this might be good news. Raiders were the common enemy of every ordinary adventurer. If Bjorn explained the situation and offered suitable compensation, the party might agree to help. Bjorn lowered his guard and told them everything he'd witnessed, hoping they'd help him escape the raider. The bald man at the front clearly didn't believe him, but after Bjorn swore on his honor as a warrior, the party finally accepted his story. They agreed to shelter Bjorn and Einar, but added one condition. If they defeated the raider together, every item she carried would belong to them. Bjorn had no objection. The bald man then explained that he'd created a concealment field within a 3-meter radius. Anyone inside the field would become invisible. It was an extremely powerful area control concealment skill, but it had one fatal weakness. No one inside could move. To avoid fighting the raider directly, Bjorn decided to enter the bald man's concealment field. But the moment Bjorn and Einar stepped inside, their bodies became immobile, their strength disappeared, and they even lost the ability to speak. At the same time, a system notification rang out. Your character has been afflicted with suppression. Seeing them completely helpless, the bald man slowly revealed a vicious grin. We're incredibly lucky. 2 barbarians walked straight into our trap. Once again, Bjorn learned that he couldn't trust humans in this world so easily. The bald man looked unbearably pleased with himself. He even mocked them. You can't move or speak, can you? Judging by their equipment, this party's strength was probably similar to Bjorn and Einar's. The other adventurers, who had remained silent until now, finally revealed their true colors. They even complained that after waiting so many days to capture a woman, they'd ended up with a female barbarian, so they weren't interested in having their way with Einar. Instead, they planned to cut out both barbarians' hearts. From their conversation alone, Bjorn could clearly sense their depravity and greed. The short man in the straw hat pulled out a sharp blade. Was Bjorn really going to die here? He'd made so many preparations just to stay alive. Yet he was still going to die in a place like this. The blade sliced through the air with murderous intent, heading straight for Bjorn's throat. With death only inches away, Bjorn's mind began racing. He had only one chance to survive. The skill would break the instant his body took damage, giving him a single opportunity to fight back. The sharp blade pierced Bjorn's throat, sending an explosion of pain through his nervous system. The stiffness immediately left his body. Bjorn jerked his head back, like a boxer winding up for a knockout punch. Under the short man's stunned gaze, Bjorn swung his hammer and smashed it directly into his face. However, Bjorn's condition was terrible. Blood kept spraying from his throat, his entire body felt weak, and his vision was rapidly fading. But he couldn't collapse yet. Bjorn barely kept himself upright, pulled the blade from his neck, and threw it toward Einar. Although the blade accidentally struck Einar in the chest, the resulting injury broke the suppression and restored her ability to move. After accomplishing that, Bjorn finally lost his strength and collapsed. At the same time, Einar drew the greatsword from her back and swung it like the Grim Reaper. With a single slash, she cut the nearby archer in half at the waist. She immediately spun around, leaped into the air, and brought her blade down on another man's head. The iron helmet he was wearing offered absolutely no protection. The helmet went flying as blood sprayed through the air. When the bald man farther away witnessed this, he fled as though he'd seen a demon. But Einar didn't immediately chase after him. Bjorn was lying on the ground, covered in blood. From Einar's perspective, he probably looked moments away from death. Bjorn used the last of his strength to shout, "Potion," but Einar merely held him and cried, repeatedly promising that she'd avenge him. Fortunately, just before Bjorn died, Einar finally took out the life-saving potion and pulled him back from the brink of death. This was also thanks to the undying art he'd received. Without it, he would have died instantly. Only after seeing the wound on his neck slowly heal did Einar finally relax. She even praised him as the greatest barbarian warrior she'd ever met for surviving a pierced throat. In her eyes, the wound had probably become a medal of honor. After Bjorn's wound healed, they collected all the enemy's equipment. Then Bjorn led Einar in the direction the bald man had fled. Fortunately, it didn't take them long to catch him. It was obvious that Einar now hated the bald man with every fiber of her being. However, to escape the terrifying woman behind them, they needed the bald man's skill. Just then, a faint whistle cut through the air as a poisoned needle buried itself in the bald man's throat. The woman had been hiding nearby and watching them the entire time. She even admitted that their previous battle had surprised her. The moment Bjorn saw her, he didn't hesitate. He simply shouted Einar's name. Nothing else needed to be said between them. As though she'd been waiting for that command, Einar instantly charged ahead of Bjorn. Since escape was impossible, their only option was to face her head-on. The raider avoided Einar's attack with nothing more than a slight bend of her body. She even used the opening created by her dodge to block Bjorn's hammer with a short sword. Bjorn had put all his strength into that strike, yet she didn't move a single step. Just how many strength essences had this woman absorbed? If Bjorn couldn't knock her down, he'd at least hold her in place. But just as Bjorn prepared to create an opening for Einar, all the strength suddenly vanished from his body. How had she done it? Had she pierced straight through his armor with a single short sword and struck his spine? At that moment, Einar roared the name of her ancestors and charged again with her greatsword. But before Einar could fully launch her attack, the raider had already flashed past her. In a single instant, Einar completely lost the ability to fight. After just one exchange, Bjorn and Einar had become helpless lambs awaiting slaughter. As though announcing their deaths, the raider coldly ordered them to stop resisting. Her short sword was coated with a powerful paralytic poison. Bjorn's mind went blank as his vision slowly faded into darkness. Their equipment, strength, and combat experience, in every possible way, the difference between them was overwhelming. No matter how desperately Bjorn searched for an answer, he couldn't find a way to reverse the situation. But just as Bjorn waited for death to arrive, the raider suddenly stopped attacking. She bent down and told him that she'd spare his life if he swore never to tell anyone what had happened that day. She added that when they'd first encountered each other, she would have offered him the same deal if he hadn't immediately run away. After all, she owed the barbarians a debt. Only then did Bjorn understand why she'd been hiding nearby without attacking them. She had simply used the bald man's party to test them without lifting a finger. For a brief moment, both sides fell silent. Then the badly wounded Einar groaned. "Don't trust that woman. She's only playing with us." But even if the raider was only playing with them, they had no other choice. Dying after being deceived was no different from dying any other way. The raider was about to offer Bjorn some time to consider. Before she could finish, Bjorn loudly swore on his honor as a barbarian warrior. There was nothing to consider because he had no other choice. Seeing how quickly Bjorn had made his decision, the woman looked down at him with a strange expression. She sprinkled some kind of powder over his wound. The wound began to heal, and feeling gradually returned to the rest of his body. After examining Bjorn, she shifted her gaze toward Einar and asked her the same question. But after thinking for a moment, the straightforward Einar actually rejected her chance to survive. The woman didn't ask again and merely nodded, but from the way she moved, Bjorn knew with absolute certainty that she intended to kill Einar. Bjorn urgently shouted, "Hurry up and swear. Didn't you promise to follow my orders? Trust me." After hearing his desperate shout, Einar looked deeply humiliated. Fortunately, she finally swore the oath in a reluctant voice. What was the point of protecting her pride if she was about to lose her life? After hearing Einar's oath, the woman didn't linger and simply turned to leave. Watching her departing figure, Bjorn instinctively asked, "What floor do you operate on?" The woman tilted her head at the unexpected question and gave a simple answer. "The 8th floor." As her figure disappeared into the darkness, Bjorn silently made a promise. If they ever met again, the outcome would be completely different. After a system notification sounded, Bjorn and Einar passed through the portal and appeared in midair. As expected, Einar still couldn't control her landing and crashed onto the 1st floor, just as she had before. But when Bjorn asked whether it hurt, Einar looked completely dejected. She muttered, "It hurts, but a warrior who has lost her honor doesn't even deserve to feel pain." Bjorn realized that her condition was serious. To Einar, swearing for her life must have been an unbearable humiliation. Most barbarians were extremely straightforward, but Bjorn couldn't allow her to remain depressed. He encouraged her. "A warrior who survives is a strong warrior. Only by staying alive will you have the chance to defeat that woman." Before Bjorn could finish, Einar interrupted him. "Don't talk for so long. I can't understand it. But I think I understand the main point. Only a warrior who overcomes humiliation can become truly strong. You're that kind of strong warrior." That wasn't what Bjorn had meant, but it didn't matter. As long as Einar regained her confidence, it was good enough. By this point, they hadn't slept for over 20 hours. After everything they'd experienced, they were both mentally exhausted. Yet Bjorn still couldn't fall asleep. His reaction wasn't as extreme as Einar's, but he felt just as miserable. It was the same feeling he'd experienced when the blonde man's party rescued him. Back then, the priest had refused to heal him, and the male warrior had even considered the potion wasted on Bjorn. They'd treated it like a handout given to a piece of garbage. But Bjorn could only lie on the ground like a dog and accept the potion. He was grateful to survive, but he'd never forgotten the humiliation he felt that day. At the time, he'd sworn that he'd never experience such humiliation again. Yet today, he'd suffered the same humiliation once more. Where had he gone wrong? Until now, Bjorn had always made what he believed to be the best decision within his limited options. But from another perspective, every decision he'd made was only meant to escape the immediate crisis before him. Then again, that was all Bjorn could do after entering this world. The moment he opened his eyes, he'd watched someone get decapitated. One unbelievable event after another had followed, forcing him to remain passive and prioritize his safety above everything else. But if Bjorn didn't change how he acted from now on, he'd eventually die in this world. In that case, it was time to change the plan. After making his decision, Bjorn woke Einar from her sleep. Then he asked for her opinion. If there were a way to become stronger, but it came with enormous danger, what would you choose? After hearing Bjorn's question, Einar answered without hesitation. "Of course I'd challenge it. If I can't become stronger, then death is the only thing waiting for me." Whether he chose an easy path or a difficult one, life would always bring unexpected dangers. In that case, Bjorn would take the initiative. This time, they'd be the ones looking for trouble. They were heading to a rift inside the labyrinth, because whatever didn't kill him would only make him stronger. There was an extremely rare area on the labyrinth's 1st floor, where 4 different species of monsters appeared together. For ordinary adventurers, the area was too dark to explore without torches, making it hardly worth the cost. Since most adventurers also wanted to reach the second floor as quickly as possible, they had no reason to visit it. But for that exact reason, it was the perfect place to hide a secret. Soon, they discovered a massive stone monument blocking their path. It had been erected to commemorate the first person who discovered this place, exactly as Bjorn remembered. That meant the conditions for activating its hidden mechanism were probably still the same. Bjorn once again warned Einar that everything about to happen had to remain secret. Without hesitation, Einar immediately swore an oath. However, she then innocently asked what a rift was. Simply put, a rift was a separate space hidden inside the labyrinth. In gaming terms, it was an instance dungeon with a limit on how many people could enter. To unlock the first floor rift, they had to arrange the magic stones of 4 different monsters in the correct order. Then place the Death Fiend's magic stone in the center to activate the mechanism. This instance dungeon allowed a maximum of 5 participants, and its difficulty depended on the strength of the adventurers matched together. Bjorn looked forward to seeing who they'd encounter. In other words, a rift was a separate space located within the labyrinth. In gaming terms, it was an instance dungeon. After entering each stage of the instance dungeon, defeating every monster inside would open the path to the next area. The rift they entered was called the Blood Citadel. A blood-red sky seemed to herald the end of the world. Countless crows circled overhead, and a black fortress loomed in the distance. Since Bjorn had used the magic stone of a rank 8 Death Fiend to open the rift, he'd already expected to enter the Blood Citadel, but seeing the place with his own eyes still filled him with an overwhelming sense of pressure. Fortunately, this was only a first-floor rift. Even so, it'd still be extremely challenging for the 2 of them. What mattered now was who would enter next. The first 5 adventurers to arrive would automatically be matched into the same rift party. Just then, the surrounding space began to ripple. Einar hurriedly shouted, "Someone's coming." Both barbarians eagerly waited to see who their first new teammate would be. Meanwhile, Owen was exploring the labyrinth's first floor alongside her older sister. Her sister repeatedly scolded her. "You used an elemental spirit again." Owen protested that killing monsters with only a dagger was exhausting, but her sister continued, "I've already told you. Even without your bow or elemental spirits, you still need to learn how to protect yourself." But all Owen could think about was Bjorn's advice. He told her to focus on strengthening the abilities she excelled at. An adventurer's basic responsibility was to trust their team and perform their own role to the best of their ability. However, to her battle-hardened older sister, that reasoning was dangerously naive. The advice itself wasn't wrong, but partnerships in this world were far more complicated. Her sister sternly warned her again, "A partner is only a partner. Never place too much trust in them." Unbeknownst to her sister, Owen continued arguing internally that Bjorn was absolutely someone she could trust. Growing impatient, Owen quickly changed the subject and urged her sister to take her to the second floor. After all, Bjorn had probably earned a fortune there. But to Owen's wealthy older sister, the profits from the second floor were insignificant. Instead, she planned to take Owen into a rift on the first floor. Apparently, Owen had heard about these special dungeons before. Owen believed that entering a rift required incredible luck, and many unfortunate adventurers had never entered one at all. However, the last rift had appeared 8 months ago, and 8 months was its maximum cooldown period. That meant another first-floor rift should open very soon. Owen still sounded skeptical. "I see. But Bjorn never told me anything like that." From her sister's perspective, no matter what she said, Owen always responded with something that foolish barbarian had told her. In her eyes, Bjorn was nothing more than a lucky beginner. He was probably struggling to hunt monsters on the second floor, after making one bad decision after another. With that thought, Owen's sister confidently declared, "Trust me. In 1 year, the difference between you and that barbarian will be enormous." Before she could finish, the sound of space being torn apart hissed through the area. Both sisters immediately turned toward the sound nearby. A dark crimson rift was slowly taking shape before them. The moment they recognized it, both elves sprinted toward it at full speed. If they entered in time, they might even reunite with Bjorn inside. Owen and her sister reached the newly opened rift and extended their hands toward the entrance. But the instant they touched it, their hands met nothing but empty air. The rift vanished before their eyes because all 5 party slots had already been filled. Meanwhile, Bjorn and Einar were waiting for the remaining party members. Bjorn knew exactly how to enter and clear this rift, but he delayed coming here until now because adventurers in this world frightened him far more than monsters. As they watched the rippling space, booming laughter rang out. A pair of short legs appeared first, followed by the rest of the man, as the rift spat him out. Their first teammate was a dwarf. Soon afterward, the remaining 2 party members were spat out through separate rifts. What surprised Bjorn most was that one of them was a mage. He couldn't believe someone of that caliber was still on the labyrinth's first floor. Unexpectedly, their temporary party had a fairly balanced composition. After hearing Bjorn's surprise, Einar hurriedly asked, "Are mages really that impressive?" The librarian was also a mage, but she didn't seem especially powerful. What Einar didn't know was that the librarian had only been a rank 9 mage. Mages were an extremely valuable resource in Rafdonia, so they weren't allowed to enter the labyrinth until they'd proven their abilities. In other words, the young woman had already proved her strength simply by reaching the rift. After hearing Bjorn's explanation, the young mage remarked, "You know quite a lot for a barbarian." She then introduced herself. "My name is Arua Raven, and I am a rank 6 mage." Although she wore a faint smile, Bjorn could tell that she had a habit of looking down on others. Raven then introduced the man behind her as a professional porter she'd hired. After Raven finished, the dwarf introduced himself. "My name is Hikarad Murad. I've been an adventurer for 3 years." No wonder Murad's equipment looked so impressive. He already had 3 years of experience as an adventurer. Bjorn and Einar briefly introduced themselves as well. Once the greetings were over, Bjorn went straight to the point. He asked Raven why someone of her caliber was still exploring the first floor. Raven gave him only a vague explanation, claiming she'd heard that a rift would open during this cycle. She then took command of the conversation and declared that the loot would be divided among the 4 adventurers, excluding the porter. In return, everyone had to follow her instructions. Murad quickly agreed, and Raven turned her attention toward Bjorn and Einar. Bjorn didn't need much time to decide. With a mage in the party, he needed to keep a low profile. After all, mages had been the first to convince the royal family that evil spirits existed and should be exterminated. But just as Bjorn prepared to agree, Einar unexpectedly rejected Raven's proposal. Her next statement left Bjorn completely stunned. "I don't know what's so impressive about mages. I want Bjorn to lead us, because he's wiser than any other warrior." Bjorn had already agreed, so he couldn't understand why Einar was doing this. He wanted to cover her mouth immediately, but that'd only make him appear even more suspicious. After noticing everyone's confused expressions, Einar began explaining with even greater enthusiasm. She announced that Bjorn read books in the library for 6 hours every day and praised him as an incredibly great warrior. Bjorn stood beside her in complete embarrassment, wishing he could crawl into a hole and disappear. Einar's excessive praise made everyone stare strangely at Bjorn. Fortunately, they dismissed the entire scene as typical barbarian behavior. Murad laughed and remarked, "Having the admiration of your wife is something worth celebrating." Einar blushed and denied it, but her protests only made her sound even more embarrassed. Regardless, the gossip-loving Murad successfully shifted everyone's attention elsewhere. More importantly, Raven didn't seem particularly interested in Bjorn. He could only hope her curiosity wouldn't turn toward him before they parted ways. Raven interrupted the group and urged everyone to get moving. She explained that she had numerous samples to collect and plenty of research to conduct. But after hearing her command, Murad tilted his head and objected. "We don't know anything about one another besides our names." Bjorn felt the same way. Every team needed to understand its members' abilities and roles. Even a hastily assembled party should exchange basic combat information before setting out. However, Raven firmly dismissed the entire process as unnecessary. She claimed that every monster in the Blood Citadel was rank 7 or below, so she could handle them by herself. Then she announced that all loot dropped by the Rift Guardian would belong to her for research purposes. Bjorn couldn't believe someone could be this shameless. Was the situation about to take another turn for the worse? Infighting had occurred countless times throughout Bjorn's years of playing Dungeon and Stone, and the cause was always money. Research might be the highest priority for a wealthy mage, but ordinary adventurers entered the labyrinth to earn a living. The Guardian's drops Raven intended to monopolize were the most valuable treasures in the entire rift. Murad's smile disappeared as his voice sank dangerously low. "Do I look like a fool to you?" The moment he finished speaking, the atmosphere turned cold and heavy. The human porter also placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. Apparently, he wasn't merely a porter. After a tense silence, Raven finally spoke first. She offered to distribute every magic stone found in the rift among the others, but the suggestion only angered Murad further. Raven tried to hide it, but the panic on her face was obvious. She clearly hadn't expected such a hostile reaction. After a brief silence, Raven offered to give up the numbered items, but demanded the Guardian's essence and anything discovered through her knowledge. Murad accepted and proposed that the two of them roll dice to decide who received the Rift Stone. But as the negotiation continued, something felt increasingly wrong. Raven and Murad were acting as though Bjorn and Einar didn't even exist. Bjorn hadn't gone through all the trouble of opening the rift just to leave with scraps. He spoke up. "You can take the essences and numbered items, but the rift stone belongs to us." Both of them immediately turned sharp gazes toward Bjorn. Raven even replied coldly, "Do you really think 2 barbarians are worth that much? We could clear this rift without you." They'd seemed perfectly friendly moments earlier, but their masks vanished the instant profit became involved. However, Bjorn's demand had only been a test, so he compromised. "We'll give up the rift stone. In exchange, we get priority on 2 essences other than the Guardians." As expected, Raven and Murad readily accepted his condition. This was probably the furthest they were willing to compromise, because nothing except the Guardians' drops held much value in their eyes. Once the negotiations ended, Raven and Murad acted as though nothing had happened. They put their friendly smiles back on, as if the previous conflict had never occurred. Adventurers truly were terrifying people. Bjorn needed to become stronger. Even if those standing above him kicked away the ladder, he'd climb upward little by little using his own strength. Only then could he protect his rights just as they did. The Blood Citadel was divided into 4 chapters. The first stage involved crossing the drawbridge at the castle entrance. The second stage was a defensive battle in the outer fortress. The third stage was the underground prison inside the inner fortress. The final stage was the demonic worship chamber inside the Lord's castle. After following the mountain path for a while, the party finally reached the entrance of the distant castle. 2 winged demon statues stood in their way. They were rank 8 gargoyles that normally remained as motionless as ordinary statues. But the moment an enemy entered their field of vision, they'd awaken and attack, making them extremely troublesome monsters. The standard strategy was to have one party member absorb the petrification skill, while everyone else destroyed the gargoyles and broke the curse. As Bjorn and Murad approached the statues, both gargoyles suddenly opened their eyes and spread their wings. At the same time, Bjorn's entire lower body instantly turned to stone. However, the petrification didn't last long, because Raven immediately cast a curse removal spell. With their petrification skill neutralized, the 2 gargoyles became helpless prey. Bjorn and Einar fought one gargoyle together, while Murad handled the other by himself. The short dwarf swung his warhammer like a madman, repeatedly smashing the gargoyle's legs. The gargoyle quickly lost its balance and crashed heavily onto the ground. As though he'd been waiting for that exact moment, Murad immediately brought his hammer down and shattered its head. So, this was how dwarves fought. They started from the bottom and systematically destroyed their opponents. The style was straightforward but surprisingly manly. When the 2 gargoyles dissolved into particles of light, several magic stones dropped onto the ground, but no one needed to pick them up. The magic stones floated into the air by themselves and flew into the porter's enormous backpack. Raven explained that she'd store the magic stones for now and distribute them after the expedition, preventing them from wasting time on minor matters. Murad then led the party through the entrance to the next area. Only now did their true exploration of the rift finally begin. Bjorn followed behind Murad with a strange sense of excitement. The area ahead was completely dark, so they clearly needed a source of light. After Raven cast a spell, a glowing sphere appeared above her palm. The dark space was instantly illuminated, and something began stirring nearby, as though drawn toward the light and sound. A group of rotten corpses slowly rose from holes in the walls and beneath the scattered debris. These monsters were called deadmen. They had no rank, granted no experience, and didn't even drop magic stones. Their bodies normally wouldn't disappear after death, unless one of them dropped an essence. Their attacks were also extremely simple, consisting of nothing more than biting and scratching. To conserve her mana, Raven decided not to waste any spells on such weak monsters. Even without magical support, the deadmen posed no real threat to the party. It didn't take the group long to eliminate every monster in the area. After a rapid series of brutal attacks, the remaining deadmen fell one after another. Before long, the entire area had been completely cleared. After killing the final deadman commander, the party obtained a horn from its body. Einar curiously asked what the horn was used for, but Murad simply smiled and told her that she'd find out soon. This time, a massive iron door blocked the path to the next area. Murad naturally asked Raven for assistance. Raven responded by casting a simple offensive spell, yet that basic spell blasted an enormous hole through the iron door. Bjorn had to admit that a mage's offensive power was truly impressive. After passing through the iron door, the party reached the stone bridge leading to the castle. However, the bridge stopped short of the castle, leaving an enormous gap. The bridge hadn't collapsed because of age. It had been designed from the beginning as a drawbridge that could be raised and lowered. At Raven's prompting, Einar prepared to use the horn they'd just obtained. She raised the horn and blew into it with all her strength. Its powerful sound immediately echoed throughout the castle. In response to the horn, the drawbridge on the opposite side began to descend. However, the drawbridge wasn't the only thing moving. Dark blood began surging through the moat surrounding the castle walls. Even more disturbingly, countless hands were struggling beneath the churning blood. Before long, the monsters began crawling out of the moat. They were the same unranked deadmen the party had fought earlier. The objective of this stage was simple. They only needed to survive until the drawbridge fully descended. But even unranked deadmen became dangerous in such overwhelming numbers on a narrow bridge. One wrong step could send someone falling into the moat. Just as the party prepared to fight cautiously, Raven confidently ordered everyone to gather around her. Then, with a sharp shout, Raven cast a spell. A violent vortex erupted around the entire party. The swirling wind acted like a massive blender, instantly tearing every dead man into pieces. After seeing the enormous horde disappear in an instant, everyone in the party gasped in amazement. Raven pretended to be modest and remarked, "They were only dead men." However, the pride in her eyes was impossible to hide. Bjorn had already expected Raven to be highly capable, but he never imagined she'd be this powerful. Inside a rift, antagonizing a mage like her could be fatal. Soon afterward, the descending drawbridge finally connected with the stone bridge. Just like that, the party completed the first chapter of the Blood Citadel with unbelievable ease. But instead of feeling pleased, Bjorn was filled with a vague sense of unease. Based on his previous experiences, the easier the beginning was, the more difficult the later stages would become. After easily crossing the drawbridge at the castle entrance, the party continued forward. They soon entered the outer fortress, and with Raven in the party, the following battles were almost unbelievably easy. A single wide area spell from Raven could eliminate 90% of an entire monster horde. Most of the remaining monsters were rank 8 death fiends, whose arms formed a protean sword and shield. Bjorn and Einar had already perfected their strategy against these monsters. One grabbed the left leg, the other grabbed the right, and on the count of 3, they brought the monster down. Murad could only stare in disbelief, proving just how efficient the two barbarians had become. While Bjorn and Einar enjoyed slaughtering the remaining monsters, Raven didn't remain idle. She focused her attention on the monsters with powerful regenerative abilities. Raven specifically cast a wound exacerbation curse, completely sealing their regeneration. Without their regenerative passive ability, the monsters became nothing more than unusually tough sacks of meat. After the battle, the dropped magic stones once again floated into the air and flew into the porter's backpack. Watching Raven walk at the front, Einar couldn't help remarking, "Now I finally understand why everyone says mages are so impressive." Murad immediately joined in with more praise. Exactly. Having a mage in the party greatly expands what we're capable of doing. Their compliments reached Raven's ears perfectly. Raven pretended to be modest and replied, "There's no need to praise me so much. I simply have a little talent and work slightly harder than most people." However, the smug satisfaction on her face was impossible to hide. Bjorn was gradually figuring out her personality. She pretended to be humble, but absolutely loved showing off. At the same time, Raven was a gifted mage with an intense passion for magical research. The easiest way to handle someone like her was to keep praising her. With everyone's cooperation, Raven quickly collected all the materials she needed for her research. Judging by how efficiently she worked, Raven had clearly done plenty of preparation before entering the rift. However, she'd overlooked the most important statue at the center of the fountain. Destroying it would reveal an extremely valuable hidden item. Since no one else knew the secret, Bjorn decided to find an opportunity to claim the item for himself. Seasoned gamers had a peculiar habit. Whenever they spotted anything suspicious, they couldn't resist hitting the interact button to check it out. Bjorn was one of those players, and over 9 years of gaming, he'd uncovered countless hidden secrets. But if a rookie barbarian knew something even a mage didn't, it'd only invite trouble. So Bjorn kept quiet and followed the party deeper into the castle. In the game's original design, the castle interior contained no monsters. It was merely a passage leading to the underground prison. To conserve Raven's mana, Hikarad fixed a torch to his helmet. With his short build, he looked like a cartoon mole miner. The underground prison was home to skull rats, banshees, death fiends, chimeric wolves, ghoul lords, corpse golems, and other monsters. Yet Raven and Hikarad, who'd nearly come to blows over the loot earlier, were now shamelessly flattering each other. They were both realists, through and through. Einar pointed to a skeletal rat by the wall and curiously asked what kind of monster it was. Raven had been enjoying everyone's praise, so the moment she saw another chance to show off, she rushed over and began explaining with a smug expression. To be fair, Raven had studied the labyrinth extensively. She explained that skull rats were unranked monsters with almost no offensive power and gave no experience. But Einar clearly couldn't stand her smug attitude. Just then, an eerie wail echoed through the underground prison. Einar's irritation vanished instantly, and she clung to Bjorn like a frightened little girl. Unfortunately, she'd forgotten that she was far stronger than an ordinary adult. If Bjorn hadn't been so sturdy, the way she shook him might have given him a concussion. Raven deliberately frightened Einar by warning her that if a banshee lashed onto her, she'd be in for something truly horrifying. What a childish mage. The moment Raven saw a chance to get even, she took it. Looking thoroughly pleased, as Einar went deathly pale, Bjorn quickly stepped in to smooth things over, since he knew mages had spells specifically designed to deal with banshees. Fortunately, Raven might have enjoyed teasing people, but she never dragged her feet when it mattered. Dropping her playful expression, Raven immediately fired a brilliant arrow of light from her staff. The spell pierced straight through the banshee. Moments later, dozens more banshees surged toward them in fury, apparently sensing the death of one of their own. Raven showed no fear. To a mage with powerful area of effect spells, the approaching swarm was practically a welcome sight. Flame baptism. As Raven finished chanting, a torrent of fire erupted from her staff and filled the entire corridor, annihilating every banshee in an instant. While the others were still stunned, Raven's calm voice broke the silence. Shall we get moving? Seeing this world through a monitor and standing inside it were two entirely different things. The moment the party entered the underground prison, a chill crawled over every inch of Bjorn's body. The prison was filled with all kinds of terrifying high-rank monsters. It was also packed with bizarre experimental instruments, making the place look like a mad scientist's laboratory. Everyone else was visibly disturbed by the horrifying surroundings. Raven remained completely unfazed. She casually explained that she loved anatomy, so none of it bothered her. Under Raven's guidance, the party soon found the hidden mechanism. As the mechanism clanked into motion, the hidden passage slowly opened, releasing a wave of putrid stench. Countless corpses were piled beyond the passage, with broken limbs and severed heads scattered across the floor. The reek of decay was so strong that it made their heads ache. In the dim light, the entire place resembled a wastewater treatment plant that had been abandoned for years. In that situation, the porter was the first to react. He braced himself with his sword and began emptying the contents of his stomach. Surprisingly, the next person to react was Raven. Her experience with dissections might have made her resistant to gruesome sights, but she was completely helpless against the stench. Even more surprisingly, Bjorn was still holding up. If he'd been in his old body, the sight alone would have made him pass out. A barbarian's body truly was incredible. It could even endure the overwhelming stench of decay. The party continued through the dark underground chamber, and every step produced a wet squelch, as though they were walking across sponges. As the torchlight reached the center of the chamber, a massive mountain of corpses gradually emerged from the darkness. Even more horrifyingly, the mountain of corpses began to speak. Like a broken recording, it repeatedly cried out in a woman's voice, "Daddy, save us." Damn it. This monster had always been silent in the game, but here it sounded terrifyingly alive. The pile of corpses slowly rose to its feet and reached toward the party with countless rotting arms. There was no time to hesitate, so Bjorn immediately prepared to rally the others for battle. But even a normally dependable Hickarod was frozen stiff with fear. These people always loved acting tough, yet when it really mattered, every last one of them fell apart. The only ones who remained clear-headed were Bjorn and Einar. "What are all of you doing?" Even Einar couldn't stop herself from shouting at them. Just then, a corpse came hurtling toward them like a shot put. It exploded just before impact, spraying rotten blood and flesh everywhere. Fortunately, the acidic fluid only splashed Einar's clothing. Hickarod, however, wasn't nearly as fortunate. In an instant, the dwarf became completely incapable of fighting. Meanwhile, Raven, who'd claimed that all they needed to do was rely on her, was still throwing up. These people were unbelievably unreliable. No wonder everything had gone so smoothly earlier. Einar, take Hickarod to the rear and protect Raven. Bjorn would have to lure the massive creature away by himself, or the entire party could be wiped out. The corpse golem's attack pattern was simple. It threw explosive corpses at distant enemies. Against nearby enemies, it used the hundreds of arms covering its body like tentacles, dragging its victims in and devouring them. That meant getting too close to the corpse golem was out of the question. Raven still hadn't recovered, so Bjorn had to buy time at any cost. He only needed to hold out until she could cast another spell. Whenever a corpse bomb came flying toward him, Bjorn rolled aside and created more distance. He then curled up behind his shield, protecting himself from the creature's acidic bodily fluids. After repeating this cycle about 3 times, Bjorn finally heard the reassuring sound of an incantation. As Raven finished chanting, flame baptism erupted from her staff once again. Bjorn didn't look back. He kept all his attention focused on the corpse golem. As hundreds of voices screamed at once, the corpse golem burst into flames, and the bodies covering its exterior began peeling away. Moments later, a massive skeleton emerged from within the mountain of corpses. Einar, join the fight now. The corpse golem might have been a rank 7 monster, but with its outer armor of corpses stripped away, Bjorn and Einar were more than capable of handling it. Bjorn and Einar worked in perfect sync, taking turns drawing the corpse golem's attention while repeatedly striking its chest. When they shattered the magic core inside its ribcage, the corpse golem finally stopped moving and dissolved into particles of light. But before the light could completely disappear, the particles suddenly began gathering again. A cluster surrounded by a faint black glow gradually appeared in the air. The mutated monster had actually dropped an incredibly rare essence. The valuable loot they dropped was also coveted by every adventurer. Most importantly, the probability of an essence dropping increased dramatically inside a rift. Considering the increased drop rate, it was stranger that this was the first essence they'd found. Either way, it rightfully belonged to Bjorn and Einar. After all, the two of them had defeated the mid-boss almost entirely by themselves. They'd also negotiated 2 priority claims on the loot before the party set out. However, Bjorn had originally been aiming for 2 other essences. The first was the Death Fiend essence, which granted regeneration. The second was the Chimeric Wolf essence, which greatly increased muscular strength. Instead, they'd obtained the essence of the Corpse Golem, a rank 7 elite monster that appeared only once inside the Blood Citadel. This essence was incredibly rare and even more difficult to obtain than Bjorn's original targets, but he still couldn't celebrate just yet. Its unique abilities were powerful, but the penalties that came with them were equally severe. First, the Corpse Golem essence's base stats were perfect for a tank. Although it lowered perception by 5 points and made the body less responsive, the boosts to its other attributes were enormous. Bone strength, which heavily affected defense, increased by 55 points, while weight, which boosted blunt weapon damage, rose by 21. Pain resistance would also be extremely useful in reality, and the essence even increased strength and poison resistance. The real problem was its active skill, Flesh Explosion. It could violently detonate any part of the user's body and inflict tremendous damage, but activating it directly consumed the user's HP. It also granted the passive skill Acidic Bodily Fluids, which made the user's blood corrosive. Whenever the user was injured, the splattered blood would steadily eat away at their own equipment. In short, the essence was powerful, but its massive potion and equipment repair costs made it a difficult, double-edged sword. Fortunately, a dropped essence remained stable for 30 minutes. Let's leave it for now and check on their injuries. Bjorn headed over to Hikarad. After this crisis, he once again realized how many differences existed between the game and this reality. Based purely on his combat abilities, Hikarad should have been able to defeat the boss easily. But psychological fear had rendered him completely incapable of fighting. Meanwhile, Raven was finally beginning to recover. That meant it was time for Bjorn to start negotiating. He and Einar had practically defeated the Corpse Golem by themselves, so he needed to establish their contribution first. It's a good thing I managed to force out that spell. Damn, what a crafty human. Instead of thanking them for saving her life, Raven immediately emphasized her own contribution. If Bjorn let her control the negotiation, he and Einar might walk away with nothing. We saved your lives. That should count as doing more than one person's share. Therefore, Einar and I get first claim on any loot dropped by the Rift Guardian. Bjorn's sudden demand plunged the entire group into silence. Before long, Hikarad spoke first and said that he agreed with Bjorn's proposal. After all, without Bjorn and Einar, they would have already lost their lives. For a moment, Bjorn thought he was in for a pleasant surprise, but after a brief silence, the crafty Raven rejected his demand. Still, she added that if the Rift Guardian dropped a Rift Stone, Bjorn and Einar would receive an equal opportunity to bid for it. The result was somewhat disappointing, but at least they'd secured the right to participate in the bidding. Now, it was time to discuss the most important matter. The Corpse Golem they'd just defeated had dropped an essence. Hikarad and Raven apparently hadn't expected such a rare essence to appear, because both of their mouths fell open. Raven reacted most strongly of all. She explained that a Corpse Golem essence was even rarer than a Guardian's essence, Even the Adventurers Guild had struggled to obtain enough samples, making it incredibly valuable to researchers. Her reaction was exactly what Bjorn had expected. The intense desire in Raven's eyes made it clear how badly she wanted the essence. That meant it was finally time for Bjorn to begin the real negotiation. Seizing the opportunity, Bjorn spoke in a low voice. "Raven, I have a proposal. I'll give you this essence, but if the Rift Guardian drops an essence, it belongs to me." The deal was simple. Bjorn would trade the Corpse Golem essence already in his possession for a Guardian's essence that might not even drop. Raven considered the offer for only a moment before her face blossomed into a radiant smile, and she eagerly accepted. She then retrieved a small essence test tube from the porter's backpack. The fact that she was willing to use such an expensive test tube on a rank 7 essence proved just how important it was to her. Once the essence had been safely stored, the party reorganized their equipment and resumed their dangerous journey through the rift. After traveling for a while, they arrived inside a spacious stone chamber. Raven carefully examined the wall before pressing one of its stone bricks inward. With the sound of a mechanism activating, a magic book dropped from a gap in the ceiling. As Hikarad showered her with praise, Raven once again wore a proud expression. The book was called the Necronomicon, a valuable grimoire containing black magic. Ordinary grimoires required distortion magic to be removed from a rift, but the Necronomicon was classified as an item and could be carried outside normally. That made it extremely valuable on the market. Damn it, Bjorn had planned to return and secretly claim it later, but Raven had clearly done her homework, leaving him no choice but to watch her take it for herself. Judging by Raven's awkward smile, she also knew that even an ordinary person could take the book outside without using distortion magic. But if she knew about the Necronomicon, why didn't she know about the other treasure hidden beneath the fountain statue? The party followed the circular path through the demon worship chamber, eliminating every monster they encountered. The monsters inside included gargoyle statues, death fiends, and chimeric wolves. The second mid-boss guarding the chamber was a rank 7 monster, known as the Bone Knight. Their luck was unbelievable. After obtaining the Corpse Golem essence earlier, they'd now received an essence from the Bone Knight as well. This kind of incredible luck didn't feel like something Bjorn was supposed to have. A rank 7 Bone Knight randomly possessed one of 3 attributes: hatred, sorrow, or yearning. A Bone Knight of sorrow could release a fog that caused mental confusion. A Bone Knight of hatred possessed the terrifying Soul Sever skill, which had a chance of directly lowering its victim's soul level. The Bone Knight of Yearning before them only possessed Life Drain, which restored its health whenever its attacks landed. Raven's Regeneration Suppression spell could easily neutralize Life Drain's healing effect. That made the Yearning type the easiest of the 3 Bone Knight variants to defeat. Was Bjorn finally escaping his terrible luck? They'd barely killed any elite monsters, yet another exceptional essence had already dropped. Hikarad and Raven each congratulated Bjorn. According to the agreement made before entering the rift, this essence belonged to Bjorn and Einar. Bjorn would be lying if he said he wasn't tempted. Only the final guardian remained, and no one knew whether another essence would drop. Even so, after careful consideration, he gave this opportunity to Einar. From an adventurer's perspective, Einar was also better suited to the essence. Life Drain worked especially well with melee warriors who used bladed weapons. Einar was also a trustworthy companion. Given her straightforward personality, she was unlikely to abandon Bjorn during future expeditions, and would probably continue fighting by his side. Rather than hastily absorbing an unsuitable essence, it'd be more efficient to strengthen Einar and use her power to obtain an essence better suited to Bjorn. Thank you, Bjorn. I'll definitely repay this favor. Once Bjorn gained his permission, Einar could no longer contain her excitement. She immediately approached the essence and eagerly absorbed it into her body. The dramatic transformation appeared before them almost instantly. Einar looked up in confusion. Bjorn, why did you suddenly get so tall? But Bjorn hadn't grown taller. Einar's had become shorter. Einar, who'd originally stood nearly 2 meters tall, had suddenly shrunk to roughly 5 feet 7. This was a basic effect of the Bone Knight essence. It greatly increased the user's bone density, but permanently reduced their height in exchange. Before Raven could even finish explaining the effect, Einar released a despairing scream. I'm doomed. Who's going to see me as a warrior when I look like this? As Einar completely lost her composure, Raven added fuel to the fire by saying that she'd become much prettier, and nobles would love such a beauty-enhancing effect. Honestly, aside from her barbarian tattoos, Einar now looked like an unusually tall human woman. Bjorn needed to step in before she sank any deeper into despair. He pointed toward a rank 8 death fiend approaching from ahead. Stop feeling sorry for yourself and use that thing to test your new strength." The others were clearly curious about Einar's transformation as well, so they stepped aside and waited for her performance. Einar gave a half-hearted battle cry, "Behelra, eh?" She then raised her greatsword and confronted the death fiend alone. What happened next wasn't an illusion. With one casual swing, Einar sliced the rank 8 monster cleanly in half. A monster that had once required dozens of combined attacks from Bjorn and Einar was now killed with a single strike. Seeing how much stronger Einar had become, Bjorn was genuinely happy for her. "Einar, second daughter of Penelin, you're no longer an ordinary warrior. I've become a stronger warrior. Thank the ancestors." Einar finally regained her confidence. Her reduced height might feel uncomfortable at first, but once she adjusted to her new body, Einar would become an incredibly powerful warrior. The party continued onward, eliminated every monster in their path, and finally reached the chamber of the Blood Citadel's final guardian. Standing before the boss chamber, Hikarad and Raven once again began exchanging encouragement and shameless flattery. But as Bjorn listened to their insincere conversation, a strange feeling of unease began growing inside him. The day had brought him far too much good fortune. In fact, everything had gone suspiciously well. Bjorn had never experienced this much luck in his entire life. Before entering this world, he'd been trapped inside a body ravaged by illness. He'd also carried feelings for someone he could never bring himself to confess to. Then he'd been dragged into the absurd situation of being transported inside a game. If the worst possible thing was about to happen, what would it be? Just then, Bjorn noticed something unusual. Wait, was the door handle always that color? No, don't open the door. But by the time Bjorn shouted his warning, it was already too late. The moment the door opened, the entire stone chamber began shaking violently. The Lord of the Blood Citadel has awakened from his slumber. As the system message echoed, a blood-red hooded figure slowly rose in the center of the vast chamber. The Rift Guardian had been replaced. The monster before them was a rank 5 creature normally encountered only on the 6th floor or deeper. Worse still, it wasn't an ordinary vampire. It was a high variant with its own identity and unique abilities. He was Vampire Duke Cambormir, an intelligent and charismatic vampire. Monsters in the game world were broadly divided into 4 categories. The first category was variants, such as goblin swordsmen and goblin archers. The second category was higher species. The death fiends Bjorn had encountered in the Land of the Dead belonged to this group. The third category was rare species, such as corpse golems that only appeared inside specific rifts. The final category was high variants, named monsters with individual memories, identities, and names of their own. That was why the party's only option was to run. Vampire Duke Cambormir was a solitary boss and a rank 5 monster who excelled at both close combat and black magic. A high variant appearing as a Rift Guardian was already extremely rare, but encountering one inside a first-floor rift was completely unprecedented. Even Bjorn, who possessed 9 years of gaming experience, had never personally encountered this guardian. He'd only learned of the monster's existence through a gameplay recording another player had uploaded to the game's forum. But while Bjorn was thinking and running for his life, Raven, who was being carried by the porter, kept whispering questions into his ear. She even asked how a complete rookie had known something dangerous was waiting inside before the door had fully opened. Bjorn tried to change the subject and told her to stop talking and focus on escaping. Raven casually replied that she was being carried, so she had plenty of time to talk, nearly making Bjorn curse out loud. In truth, what had alerted Bjorn was the unusual color of the door handle. He'd attempted the same strategy shown in the recording countless times, but the Guardian had never appeared. Only after repeatedly studying the footage did he notice the slight difference in the door handle's color. Even worse, once someone entered a rift, they couldn't leave the instance without defeating its final Guardian. Just as Hikarad was about to encourage everyone to stop and fight, Vampire Duke Cambormir suddenly appeared before them. He'd caught up in the form of black mist after casting Spiritization. This was exactly why Bjorn hated Guardians who used magic. They never followed conventional rules. Raven reacted the instant the vampire appeared, since she also understood the black magic used by Vampire Duke Cambormir. Spiritization allowed Cambormir to transform into black mist and move at tremendous speed. His physical body couldn't move during the spell, but materialization allowed it to instantly appear wherever the mist had traveled. Fortunately, Raven immediately unleashed a powerful light spell and forcibly dispelled Cambormir's spiritization. That meant the Vampire Duke would have to chase the party using his physical body. Raven's quick response had bought them at least 3 minutes to escape. But just as Bjorn began feeling relieved, he received some unexpected bad news. Raven, The mage who knew the correct route had suddenly passed out. As far as Bjorn knew, vampires didn't possess any ability that could make an enemy suddenly lose consciousness. Could Cambermere have an essence skill Bjorn didn't know about? Whatever the truth was, they first needed to escape the underground prison. Hikarad and the others agreed, but with Raven unconscious, no one was available to guide them along the correct route. At this point, Bjorn had to prioritize survival, even if displaying his knowledge made him appear suspicious. Under Hikarad's disbelieving gaze, Bjorn took the lead and guided the party along the correct escape route. Everyone was breathing heavily, but their excellent stamina kept anyone from falling behind. The problem was that they couldn't shake the cloud of black mist pursuing them. Fortunately, the mist created by spiritization was extremely vulnerable to sunlight, and it was still daytime outside. Before long, the party spotted the exit illuminated by daylight. At the last possible moment, they finally burst out onto the surface. Hikarad stared at Bjorn in disbelief. "You memorized the entire route after traveling through it only once? I can't believe you're a rookie barbarian who completed his coming-of-age ceremony just last month." Bjorn had no idea how he was supposed to explain himself. Fortunately, his loyal supporter Einar rescued him from the awkward situation. In her eyes, everything Bjorn did proved that he was the wisest and greatest barbarian warrior alive. But after their brief moment of relief, the entire party was overcome by a renewed sense of danger. The sun was already beginning to sink below the horizon. Once night fell, Vampire Duke Cambormere would be free to appear before them again. The first thing they needed to determine was when Raven would regain consciousness. Bjorn also needed to use this brief opening to retrieve the hidden treasure Raven had overlooked earlier. The item could be found beneath the rubble after destroying the goddess statue in the center of the dried-up fountain. It was called the Tear of the Goddess, a well-known consumable holy relic from the game. It could be used for healing or to deal devastating damage to enemies with an unholy attribute. Fortunately, by the time Bjorn retrieved the crucial item and returned, Raven had regained consciousness. After speaking with her, Bjorn learned that Raven believed she'd been affected by the vampire's pain sharing. She'd then forced herself to cast another spell, triggering magical circuit backlash and causing her to pass out. Raven estimated that after resting for about 20 minutes, she'd recover enough to cast roughly 5 rank 7 attack spells. That level of firepower still wouldn't be enough to defeat the vampire, so Bjorn bluntly asked whether she knew any solar attribute attack magic. Raven responded coldly, explaining that asking a mage to reveal their hidden spell repertoire was extremely rude. Bjorn already knew that, but he was currently a barbarian who spoke respectfully to no one except the king. His eyes bluntly gave Raven the answer. So what? Faced with his shameless attitude, Raven could only let out a helpless sigh. She then admitted that she could cast one attack spell known as Sunspot Sphere. Sunspot Sphere resembled a fireball in its basic form, but it was a rank 6 solar attribute attack spell combining fire and holy properties. However, in Raven's current condition, she would need at least 30 minutes of preparation before she could cast it. This was their strongest trump card, so Bjorn immediately gave his order. "We'll hold out for 30 minutes. Don't interfere unnecessarily and conserve your mana." Raven was about to agree when she suddenly realized something and loudly demanded to know why a rookie barbarian was acting as the party leader. The mage was remarkably perceptive. Hikarad and the porter had begun following Bjorn's orders without even noticing it. Yet Raven had spotted it almost immediately after waking up. She looked at the porter, Hikarad, and Einar in turn, and when they all showed their approval of Bjorn, she reluctantly nodded. Hikuro confidently added that he'd always possessed a good eye for people, and Bjorn was someone they could trust. Just as this brief interruption came to an end, a cold wind swept past them, and the shadows covering the ground grew thicker as night finally descended. There was nowhere left to retreat, and Raven still needed 30 minutes to prepare her magic. The party now had only one objective. No matter the cost, they had to survive until Raven was ready. The moment darkness fell, the vampire who'd been staring down at them like a descending god gradually took on a savage expression. A horrifying roar erupted from Cambormere's throat. Long black claws and enormous wings slowly emerged from his body. Everything was exactly as it had been in the game. No matter how intelligent a monster was, it would only exchange a few symbolic words before immediately entering combat. Bjorn had hoped to buy time through conversation, but that plan had completely failed. Without further warning, Cambormere launched the first attack. Hikarad bravely stepped forward. The killing intent of a rank 5 boss was enough to paralyze an ordinary person. Yet the dwarf successfully blocked the vampire's ferocious blow. Even after taking such a powerful hit, Hikarad didn't retreat a single step. His pathetic behavior against the corpse golem had completely vanished. This was the true foundation of a 3-year adventurer. At the same time, Hikarob began revealing his essence abilities. His first skill was counterweight, granted by the essence of the rank 7 monster known as the Iron Tusk. As long as his feet remained on the ground, he couldn't be easily knocked down or pushed back. Counterweight also absorbed part of the impact, making it an excellent skill for a tank. As the battle began, Bjorn immediately exchanged a glance with Einar. Perhaps it was because they'd already survived so many deadly situations together. A single look was enough for them to understand each other. Bjorn and Einar assumed their fighting stances and attacked the vampire from opposite sides. But Cambormir wasn't to be underestimated. Judging by his reactions, the vampire possessed extremely high combat intelligence. Before Einar's attack could land, Cambormir predicted its trajectory and swiftly dodged aside. What he didn't realize was that Bjorn was already waiting at his landing point. Bjorn's attack landed directly on Cambormir, but it barely affected him. Instead, a violent recoil shot through Bjorn's arm and left it completely numb. This had to be the same pain-sharing ability that had affected Raven earlier. Meanwhile, the vampire retreated into the distance as his body began transforming. Cambormir's body instantly split apart into hundreds of crows. The massive flock beat its wings and dived toward the party at incredible speed. Hikarod immediately activated a skill and raised his shield at the front of the formation. But the moment the crows struck their targets or the ground, they began exploding, one after another. The explosions themselves weren't especially powerful, but the blood spraying everywhere was far more troublesome. This was the vampire's skill, Mark of Sacrifice. Every living creature splashed with the blood was branded as a sacrifice, greatly increasing the caster's physical abilities based on the number of marked targets nearby. Cambormir's second skill was Eternal Life. The more HP the user lost, the more powerful their regeneration became. His third skill was Master of Blood, which allowed him to steal part of a target's abilities by directly drinking their blood. All 3 skills were devastating in close combat. But those essence skills weren't the end of it. The Vampire Duke also possessed a wide variety of black magic. He could transform into black mist at any moment, allowing physical attacks to pass straight through him. He could also split into hundreds of crows that exploded upon impact. He could even use spilled blood to summon undead creatures. This named high variant possessed an absurd number of powerful abilities. Just then, the party received more terrible news. Hikarod, their main defender, finally failed to withstand the vampire's relentless attacks. The dwarf completely lost the ability to fight and collapsed unconscious. The battle instantly shifted in the vampire's favor, while Bjorn and Einar were already covered in wounds. With their main tank down, maintaining their defensive line was nearly impossible. If this continued, the entire party would be defeated one by one. Bjorn quickly made his decision. He immediately ordered Einar to carry the unconscious Hikarod to the rear. From that moment onward, Bjorn would face the rank 5 boss alone. Of course, Bjorn didn't possess the strength to fight it head-on. He didn't even need an offensive weapon anymore. His only job now was to become the vampire's human punching bag. Damn, that hurts. Come on, you bastard. Keep stabbing. While enduring the vampire's attacks, Bjorn continuously poured healing potions down his throat. Raven watched the entire insane spectacle from a distance. In her eyes, Bjorn's fighting method had completely surpassed the limits of ordinary understanding. Even after reading countless records about famous adventurers, Raven had never encountered a strategy based on tanking attacks while constantly drinking potions. According to this world's common sense, fighting while consuming healing potions should have been absolutely impossible. The pain caused by a potion was beyond imagination, and the more severe the injury, the more agonizing the healing process became. Steam poured from Bjorn's wounds, while dense smoke covered his entire body. In that condition, even if the injuries didn't kill him, the overwhelming pain could easily send him into fatal shock. Yet, Bjorn somehow kept blocking the attacks. The fact that he could still move was a miracle, while every strike he failed to stop continued tearing his body apart. Even so, the vampire kept aiming for vital points like Bjorn's head and heart. But Bjorn accurately blocked every attack that would have killed him. Watching this unfold, Raven remembered something her teacher had once told her. A barbarian's true value didn't lie in superior physical ability. A barbarian's true strength came from unbreakable mental fortitude. Remembering those words, Raven felt deeply ashamed of her own behavior. A barbarian who'd only recently completed his coming-of-age ceremony was desperately fighting for a chance to survive. Yet, Bjorn remained calm and continued making the best possible decisions for the situation. Meanwhile, Raven could only hide in the rear and helplessly watch everything unfold. If Bjorn fell, everyone would die, so Raven needed to make a decision immediately. A mage's job wasn't limited to casting offensive spells from the rear. It also meant using knowledge to analyze the situation and guide the party toward the best course of action. To keep everyone alive, Raven had to make the optimal choice, and this was the best thing she could do as a mage. Losing the essence would hurt, but even something that valuable couldn't compare to her life. Raven slowly gathered her mana and cast support magic to boost accuracy, extend the throwing range, and automatically correct the projectile's trajectory. Once the preparations were complete, she hurled the test tube with all her strength. The test tube traced a perfect arc through the air and flew straight toward Bjorn. The moment it struck Bjorn, the test tube shattered and released a brilliant light. The corpse golem essence has permeated Bjorn Yandel's soul. Pain resistance increased by 70, strength increased by 15, bone density increased by 55, soul level increased to 2. Bjorn's mind went blank, and even his vision began to blur. If anyone asked whether it hurt, Bjorn wanted them to come experience it for themselves. It felt like his entire body had been repeatedly stabbed before salt water was poured into every wound. Bjorn wanted to stop resisting and accept his fate, but he forcibly cast every trace of weakness from his mind. Whenever someone reached a crossroads in life, they had to make a choice. Bjorn had to decide what he was willing to sacrifice and what he'd protect in return. Since he couldn't block every attack, Bjorn chose to sacrifice non-vital areas like his arms and legs. Injuries there wouldn't kill him immediately, but he had to block every attack aimed at his vital points. Just then, Bjorn suddenly felt the pain begin to fade. His exhausted body surged with fresh strength. Even the vampire's claws could no longer easily pierce his bones. Had someone made him absorb the corpse golem essence? The thought of drastically changing his character build was painful, but in the short term, this was an incredibly welcome development. The vampire seemed fascinated by prey that could suddenly move again, so it attacked even more ferociously, while Bjorn kept moving to evade it. But nothing fundamentally changed. The punching bag that had taken hits on the ground could now take them standing up. That was the full extent of the change brought by the corpse golem essence. Just then, a glass bottle came flying toward Bjorn from a distance. The moment its liquid splashed across his body, his torn wounds began healing even faster. It seemed Raven finally realized that her own life was hanging by a thread. High-grade potions truly were different, and their powerful regeneration continuously restored Bjorn's body. At this rate, Bjorn finally had a chance to go toe-to-toe with the vampire. Instead of remaining on the defensive, Bjorn lunged straight at the vampire. So what if it carved through his flesh and tore apart his muscles? Bjorn's acidic blood would corrode the vampire's body in return. Meanwhile, Bjorn's own wounds would heal again within seconds. With the porter taking over Murad's care, Einar rejoined the battle. However, the slight improvement in the battle was only temporary. That was the difference in rank. Once the vampire adjusted to their tactics, it immediately seized control of the battle again. Instead of one meat shield, the party now simply had 2. The entire group fought with everything they had just to keep the vampire occupied. Then, Bjorn finally heard the words he'd been waiting for. "Bjorn, Sunspot Sphere is ready." Damn it. This was the moment Bjorn had been waiting for. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Bjorn violently shoved the vampire away. He immediately shouted for Murad to launch his attack. Bjorn hadn't explained this plan beforehand, not even once. Fortunately, Murad understood immediately. Though only partly recovered, he activated lightning and followed it with release. Lightning channeled a powerful current through part of Murad's body, while release expelled that accumulated energy outside. The electricity inside his hammer formed a sphere and shot toward the vampire like a cannonball. The powerful current exploded across the battlefield. Despite its deafening sound, the attack caused relatively little physical destruction, but the combo's true purpose was to place the enemy in a brief stunned state. This was the opportunity Bjorn had been waiting for all along. Even through countless crises, Bjorn had saved the tear of the goddess hidden inside his boot for this exact moment. Bjorn sprinted toward the vampire and shoved the tear of the goddess into its open mouth. He followed with a vicious uppercut, forcibly snapping the vampire's jaws shut. At the same moment, something shattered inside the vampire's body. The grace released by the tear of the goddess temporarily sealed all the enemy's resistances and inflicted massive damage. Blood immediately began pouring uncontrollably from the vampire's mouth. But before Bjorn could celebrate, Raven completed her final incantation. Damn it, Bjorn hadn't even had time to escape the blast radius. A blazing sphere like a miniature sun suddenly filled his entire vision. The last thing Bjorn remembered was the strangely delicious smell of roasted meat. Then his consciousness slowly faded into darkness. When Bjorn opened his eyes again, he saw a dim sky above him and heard nothing around him. Had everyone been caught in Sunspot Sphere and knocked unconscious as well? To find out, Bjorn forced himself to roll over and examine his surroundings. The sight before him left Bjorn stunned. What the hell happened? The battered vampire was somehow still alive. Both arms were gone, and bones were visible through its exposed chest. The vampire didn't appear to be conscious either. But what Bjorn couldn't accept was that its wounds were already healing. From what Bjorn remembered, eternal life greatly increased regeneration in proportion to lost health, while a vampire couldn't truly die as long as its heart remained intact. At this rate, the vampire would completely recover before long. Bjorn still couldn't understand what had happened, but everyone except him had clearly collapsed. That meant there was now one more task only Bjorn could complete. He had to kill Vampire Duke Cambormir before it regained consciousness. There was no other choice. Bjorn dragged his ruined body forward. Every step brought indescribable agony, but he refused to stop. The vampire's entire body had been devastated, yet its heart remained unharmed. It must have shielded its vital point with both arms when Sunspot Sphere struck. After crawling on top of the vampire, Bjorn raised his fists and repeatedly hammered the area above its heart. But no matter how hard Bjorn punched, he couldn't break through the ribs protecting its heart. Then, Bjorn remembered one of the abilities granted by the corpse golem Essence Flesh Explosion. Bjorn pressed one hand against the vampire's chest and activated the skill, causing the flesh of his palm to explode. The blast wasn't powerful, but the acid in Bjorn's blood and flesh still left a dent in the vampire's chest. Bjorn had never expected one attempt to be enough, so he activated Flesh Explosion again and again. As he repeatedly detonated his own flesh, Bjorn's instincts warned him that his body was rapidly reaching its limit. Continuing like this might eventually kill the vampire, but Bjorn would undoubtedly die along with it. Even so, he had no intention of stopping. Bjorn wasn't sacrificing himself to save his companions. Some might think he'd gone insane, but Bjorn was certain this was the only path with even the slightest chance of survival. But a new problem emerged. Bjorn's hands had been blown apart until only the bones remained. Since he could no longer use them, he wrapped his body tightly around the vampire and pressed his chest against it. Bjorn activated Flesh Explosion one more time. This attempt finally succeeded, and the vampire's body dissolved into countless particles of light. After receiving a series of experience rewards, Bjorn's soul level increased by 1. But Bjorn felt no joy because Dungeon in Stone didn't fully restore a character's health after a level up. Even so, Bjorn refused to abandon his final sliver of hope. Leveling up increased the number of essences he could absorb. If the Guardian Essence dropped at its roughly 33% rate, absorbing the Vampire Essence might save his life. Just as Bjorn believed death had finally arrived, his eyes suddenly opened. Einar's concerned face filled his vision, and his head was resting on her lap. Had he really survived? None of his other companions were anywhere in sight. Bjorn immediately asked where Murad and the others had gone. Einar told him that they'd already left 3 days earlier. Bjorn realized that he'd been unconscious for 3 full days. Including that time, this was now the 7th day since he'd entered the labyrinth. That realization instantly cleared Bjorn's head, and he quickly examined his condition. The hands he remembered destroying were completely restored, and no wounds remained anywhere on his body. Aside from his intense hunger, he appeared perfectly healthy. Then Bjorn noticed that he was practically naked, with only a small scrap of cloth wrapped around his waist. Einar casually explained, "Your ruined clothes were an eyesore, so I tore them all off. Raven left that cloth for you." She even added, "You don't need to be embarrassed. Bjorn truly is a great warrior. Wasn't this blatant sexual harassment?" To escape the awkward situation, Bjorn quickly changed the subject and asked whether anything unusual had happened while he was unconscious. According to Einar, the vampire had dropped all 3 of its highest tier rewards. Murad had taken the numbered item. Raven had taken the Rift Stone. As for Bjorn, the fact that he was still alive meant he'd absorbed the vampire essence. They'd originally agreed to roll dice for the Rift Stone, but Raven forcefully skipped that process and claimed she needed it to compensate for her losses. Before leaving, Raven angrily argued that Bjorn had already received the most valuable reward, so taking the Rift Stone was only fair. From Einar's recollection, Raven seemed to be the only one who knew that Bjorn had absorbed the vampire essence. Raven had also used the corpse golem essence and a large supply of high-grade potions on Bjorn. After considering everything, Bjorn realized that Raven had indeed suffered enormous losses during the expedition. Bjorn had no complaints about the loot distribution, But Einar's sulking expression made it clear that she was still furious with Raven and the others. Bjorn immediately reassured her. "Thank you. Having you beside me made me feel safe." A single compliment restored Einar's mood, proving that barbarians were much easier to deal with. Raven's extensive knowledge had helped her claim many hidden treasures, but there was one item she definitely hadn't found. Of course, Bjorn first needed something more decent to cover himself with. After finishing everything inside the rift, Bjorn finally returned safely to Rafdonia. The long mist, sunlight, and noisy crowds appeared before him, proving that Bjorn had once again survived a deadly ordeal. After enduring so much, Bjorn couldn't help wondering how much profit this expedition would bring him. Yet, cashing in all the magic stones earned him only 230,000 gold. That felt pitiful compared to what he'd endured, but he'd also absorbed 2 rare essences. Just as Bjorn reached for the money, but the spectacled clerk suddenly pulled it back and asked suspiciously, "That's far too much for a rank 9 adventurer. What's inside the backpack on your back?" Bjorn froze because nothing like this ever happened while he was playing the game. Before he could react, a group of guards rushed over and surrounded him at the counter. Damn it. Bjorn had barely made it back alive, and now they were taking him to an interrogation room. Meanwhile, Owen emerged among the crowd at Rafdonia's labyrinth entrance, dragging her exhausted body forward. The bright, noisy surroundings sharply contrasted with the labyrinth, causing memories of her expedition to flood her mind. The monsters on the 3rd floor had been far stronger than Owen expected, and she'd witnessed the terrifying power of rank 7 monsters for the first time. Although her sister had handled most of the fighting alone, the rank 6 monster they encountered near the end had still pushed them both to their limits. But the thought of telling Mr. about all those incredible experiences immediately brought excitement back to Owen's tired face. She was slightly worried that he'd subject her to another inhuman physical examination, but she still wanted to see Mr. and show off her newly acquired essence. Owen then headed to the nearest exchange counter for rank 9 adventurers. Her magic stones were worth 184,100 gold, an enormous profit for a rank 9 adventurer. However, Owen had a wealthy and highly experienced older sister. Once the clerk confirmed her sister's identity, the earnings seemed perfectly reasonable, and no further questions were asked. After exchanging the magic stones, Owen met her sister, dropped off their belongings, and eagerly began preparing to visit Bjorn. Humming cheerfully, she spent 3 full hours washing away the grime and changing into clean clothes. Owen imagined using her own earnings to treat Mr. to a delicious feast. That thought alone made her steps toward the inn feel much lighter. But when Owen reached the inn, the guest in room 302 still hadn't returned. Despite her unease, she remained convinced that Mr. would be back soon. Yet the hours continued passing, and even long after sunset, Bjorn still hadn't returned. Then, the innkeeper suddenly began removing Bjorn's belongings from his room. Owen angrily tried to stop him from clearing out someone else's room, but the innkeeper's next words dragged her back to a cruel reality. The labyrinth had already closed, yet Bjorn still hadn't returned. As far as the innkeeper was concerned, there was only one explanation. Bjorn had died inside the labyrinth. After being forcibly removed from the inn, Owen curled up alone outside, still unable to accept what she'd heard. Adventurers dying inside the labyrinth might be common, but Owen couldn't even imagine Mr. being dead. Owen remained outside the inn for 2 full days. By the time her sister came to retrieve her, she'd made a firm decision to become strong enough to protect everyone she cherished.